Hi friends, tonight, let me take you far away from the noise of today's world and carry you into the whispering woods of medieval England. This is the tale of what it might have truly felt like to live as Robin Hood, the man, the myth, the green-clad outlaw who wandered Sherwood Forest beneath the drifting mists and ancient oaks. Each night we shall walk deeper into his hidden world to see not just the hero of legend, but the human being who laughed, feared, dreamed, and fought to protect the poor in a time of harsh kings and hungry peasants. Rest your eyes now, and come with me to a place where the past breathes softly among the leaves. Our tale begins on an early spring morning, when the frost still lingered on the bracken and the first shy buds of wildflowers pushed through the sleeping forest floor. Robin of Locksley, as he was once called, rose from his blanket of moss and wool, brushing twigs from his tunic. A quiet dawn found him crouched beside a slow-moving stream, washing his face in water clear enough to mirror the green canopy overhead. His breath formed little clouds in the chill air, and a blackbird trilled somewhere nearby, greeting the day. He was not yet the famed Hood, not yet the terror of corrupt sheriffs and greedy nobles, but a young man marked by restless blood and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Around him, the forest was his home and fortress both, its gnarled oaks and twisting hazel offering shelter and secrets known only to those who listened. The forest could feed a man, hide him, heal him, and betray him if he was careless. Robin had learned all these lessons well. He pulled a small round loaf of coarse bread from his satchel, broke it, and shared the crumbs with a curious wren that hopped close to his boots. His bow lay across his knees, a simple yew stave polished smooth by his hands. Beside it rested a quiver of arrows fletched with goose feathers, each one shaped by the same hands that would loose them. For Robin, every arrow was a promise to himself that he would never again kneel before a man who took more than he gave. As the sun climbed, mist rose from the forest floor like a slow exhalation. Robin listened to the waking sounds, deer stepping lightly through the undergrowth, a squirrel chattering overhead, the rustle of distant leaves that might be wind or man or something in between. He knew the difference. He had to. He thought back to the manor at Locksley, where once he had slept under a solid roof, warm and fed, though never truly free. His father had taught him the art of the bow in secret, whispering of old Saxon rights and Norman lords who taxed the poor until their bones bent under the weight. Robin's mother had sung him lullabies of ancient kings who would come again, kings who would return fairness to the land. Such songs, he would later learn, were dangerous things to remember. He rose to his feet and checked the leather bracer on his forearm, tugging it tight. A life lived outside the law required discipline in every detail. One loose string on his bowstring, one dull arrowhead, could be the difference between escape and capture. Or worse. A soft whistle drifted through the trees. Robin's head turned sharply. It was Will Scarlet, his cousin, companion, and sometimes his greatest test of patience. Will appeared from behind an old beech, grin wide, hair tousled, his jerkin patched at the elbows. "Morning, Rob," Will said, his voice carrying like a bird's song. "There's word from the village. The sheriff's men ride again." Robin's face remained still, though his jaw tightened. He motioned for Will to sit beside him on a fallen log. They shared the last of the bread, talking in low voices. Beneath their calm words lay the pounding truth, that each raid, each new tax, each hungry child in Nottinghamshire bound their fates more tightly to these woods. "Did they take much this time?" Robin asked, brushing crumbs from his palm. "Half the barley," Will said. "Old Nan wept so loud they struck her for it. Said it was the king's share, though the king sits far away and sees naught but coin." Robin's eyes drifted to the canopy above, where sunlight speckled through in shifting patches of gold. He wondered if the king ever dreamt of the people who scraped for crumbs in his name. If he did, he never stirred to help them. A jay shrieked somewhere to the north, a warning call, clear as a church bell to those who understood. Robin and Will fell silent, listening for the soft drumbeat of hooves on the leaf-carpeted path. They knew these woods better than any forester, but the sheriff's men came armed with more than swords and mail. They came with the law, a law that declared men like Robin and Will outlaws for daring to stand between coin and crown. Robin bent low, gathering his bow and quiver, The forest seemed to breathe with him, shadows flickering like thoughts he had not yet spoken aloud. He motioned for Will to move, and together they melted into the undergrowth, leaving no mark behind but a few scattered crumbs for the birds. Above them, the sky brightened. Another day in the greenwood. Another day to remain free, to outwit those who would see them swing from the gallows. For Robin Hood, the adventure was not in grand deeds alone, but in every heartbeat spent in defiance of a world that sought to break him. Tonight, friends, rest with this image of Robin as he was at dawn, young, hungry, unbowed, his boots damp with dew, his eyes set on the path ahead. Tomorrow, we shall follow him deeper into Sherwood, where more than foxes and deer roam the tangled thickets, and where legend begins to wake with the rustling leaves. Sleep softly now, knowing that in the greenwood a bowstring is strung tight, and the outlaw king is just beginning his watch. Morning in Sherwood Forest was never quite silent, even when the world seemed hushed beneath its cathedral of ancient trees. The sun filtered through layers of budding leaves, dappling the earth in shifting mosaics of green and gold. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker drummed its patient rhythm on the hollow trunk of an old elm. The forest lived and breathed with secrets, and within those secrets walked Robin Hood, his feet light upon the mossy ground. He moved swiftly along a narrow deer trail that twisted like a river through the underbrush. Every few steps he paused, listening for the snap of a twig that did not belong, the hush of fabric brushing against bramble. Behind him, Will Scarlet followed at a respectful distance, careful not to disturb Robin's focus. Between them stretched a bond of trust forged not just in kinship, but in countless escapes, half-whispered plans, and the unspoken vow that neither would leave the other to the mercy of the sheriff's rope. When they were sure no one followed, they came at last to an ancient oak, its trunk so wide that 4 grown men could not wrap it round with their arms. Beneath its roots lay a hollow, cleverly concealed by ferns and last autumn's fallen leaves. Robin knelt, brushed aside the camouflage, and lifted a small wooden box from the hidden cavity. Inside lay a handful of silver pennies, a coil of waxed string for bow repairs, a bundle of salt pork wrapped in linen, and a scrap of parchment scrawled with marks that only Robin could read. He studied it in the shifting light, tracing the faded lines with a calloused finger. "It's from Alan," Will said quietly, crouching beside him. Robin nodded. Alan, a Dale, the silver-tongued minstrel who drifted from village to village, carried news wrapped in song and rhyme. Where a peasant might fear to speak plainly, Alan wove truth into his ballads, and the lords who thought him harmless never guessed that beneath his verses lay a map of revolt. "He says the miller's boy saw carts loaded with grain headed for Nottingham," Robin murmured. 3 wagons, guarded by 8 men each." Will let out a low whistle. "A king's feast, that would be." "To the king it goes," Robin said, voice flat. "Taken from the mouths of those who sowed it. Old Nan's barley, and more besides." He tucked the parchment back inside the box, his brow furrowed in thought. The forest around them seemed to lean closer, listening. Robin's mind turned through the paths and glades of Sherwood, the hidden gullies where a small band of men could wait unseen, the narrow fords where wheels sank deep in mud. "There's the old Roman road," Will suggested. "They'd take it for speed." "They'd risk the marshes before they'd risk the Roman stones," Robin said. "Too many clear lines of sight. Better the forest track west of Widow's Hollow. They think we fear the open ground." "And do we?" Robin's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. "Only fools fear the open when the trees stand guard." He replaced the box in its hollow and covered it again with careful hands. To survive as an outlaw was to remember every hiding place, every false trail, every sign carved into bark or stone that would lead a lost friend home. Sherwood's secret paths were written in memory and in the very rhythm of Robin's heartbeat. Together they rose and made their way deeper into the greenwood, where brambles snagged at their boots and wood pigeons fled at their passing. They came upon a clearing where 4 other figures waited beside a smoking fire. John Little, called Little John in jest and truth alike. Much the miller's son, whose honest face belied a quick wit and quicker dagger, Alan a Dale himself, humming a tune as he strummed a battered lute, and Friar Tuck, broad of belly, sharp of tongue, a man of God whose sermons often ended with laughter and ale. Little John rose, towering over the others like a friendly giant. His staff leaned against a stump, its surface polished smooth by countless parries and blows. He greeted Robin with a thump on the shoulder that nearly knocked him sideways. "Good day to you, Robin," John rumbled. "Alan's told us of the grain." "And I've seen the wagons myself," Alan added, plucking at a loose string on his lute. "Painted with the sheriff's crest. He rides behind, fat and sweating like a pig, ready for slaughter." Robin took a seat by the fire, warming his hands over the glowing coals. The smell of roasting rabbit drifted up, mingling with the crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth. He looked around at these men who had chosen the outlaw life beside him, each one with his own reason: hunger, injustice, pride, loyalty. Around this small circle of flame, Robin found a family stronger than blood alone. "3 wagons," Robin said, his voice calm. "We take them at the hollow ford. The bend in the stream will slow them. We use the fallen log as a barricade. John and I at the front. Will and Alan to harry them from the flanks. Much and Tuck gather the grain and the coin. No needless blood." "No needless blood," Tuck echoed, though a glint in his eye suggested he did not mourn the occasional bruise dealt to the sheriff's men. Little John laughed, a sound like distant thunder. "If they yield their silver easy, none shall bleed. If not, well, the forest will drink what it must." They spoke of the plan until the sun climbed high and shadows crept away from the heart of the glade. Each man knew his place, his movement, his escape should things go ill. To live outside the king's law meant living with one's life strung on the same tension as an arrow notched and drawn. One snap, one slip, and all would fall. When at last the talk was done, Robin rose and gazed out through the trees. Somewhere beyond this quiet stand of beeches and oaks, the sheriff's wagons rolled on, wheels creaking under the weight of stolen grain. Between here and there lay a narrow ford, a few felled branches, and the courage of 6 men who had chosen freedom above fear. "Tonight we rest," Robin said. "Tomorrow we remind Nottingham whose forest this truly is." The others nodded, gathering closer to the warmth of the fire as dusk approached. Above, the leaves whispered secrets to the cooling wind, and the shadows deepened into shapes that might have been stories themselves. Here in the heart of Sherwood, Robin Hood sat with his band of brothers, planning not just a raid, but a promise kept. That no tyrant's hunger would ever starve the poor while a single outlaw could still draw breath and bowstring alike. And so the greenwood waited with him, as old as England's bones, ready to keep his secrets for yet another day. Morning came softly to the hidden camp in Sherwood, carrying with it the damp hush of dew and the faint warmth of a rising sun. Robin rose before the others, as he always did, moving through the trees like a shadow among shadows. He listened to the slow crackle of dying embers, the faint snore of Little John curled by the fire, the distant hoot of an owl reluctant to give up the night. He checked his bowstring, pulling it taut and smooth between calloused fingers. His arrows lay in neat rows beside him, their goose-feather fletchings combed and straight. Each was a whisper of defiance, shaped from the same greenwood that gave him shelter and strength. One by one, the others woke. Will Scarlet roused himself with a grin, flicking twigs from his tangled hair. Alan Adale stretched and hummed a line of melody, soft and mournful, attuned to steady his thoughts. Much the miller's son yawned wide enough to swallow a squirrel, then set about packing what little food they carried: cold rabbit bones, a crust of rye bread wrapped in linen. Little John rolled to his feet, all brawn and sleepy good humor, his staff already balanced across his shoulder. Friar Tuck muttered a blessing over the embers, asking that no soul be lost today, unless the sheriff's men pressed too hard, in which case he left the matter to God's broader judgment. They moved out together just as dawn touched the treetops, slipping between hazel and hawthorn, boots brushing aside bluebells that nodded underfoot. Their path wound deeper into Sherwood's secret heart, where the air smelled of moss and damp bark, and the bird song softened at their passing. By mid-morning they reached Hollow Ford, a shallow stream that trickled through a sun-dappled clearing, flanked on either side by a tumble of rocks and old fallen trees. The water gleamed silver under the first full light, its banks soft with mud and lined with reeds that whispered in the breeze. Robin stood at the edge of the ford, one foot on a half-submerged stone, scanning the track that wound from the distant village. Here the wagons would slow. Here the horses would falter in the soft earth. Here the sheriff's men, confident in their numbers, would not see the green shadows watching from the banks. "John," Robin said, nodding to the largest of the fallen oaks that stretched across the narrowest point. "Help me with this." The two men worked in silence, heaving the log into position so that it lay like a gate across the ford. Will and Much dragged brush and branches to mask the barricade until the last possible moment. Alan and Tuck scattered footprints in the mud to look like a family of foragers had passed through, a ruse for any scout who rode ahead. When all was done, Robin crouched behind the bracken on the eastern bank. He could hear the distant clatter of hooves on packed earth, the faint jingle of harness and chainmail. He drew an arrow from his quiver, ran his thumb along the shaft, and knocked it loosely against his bow. Beside him, Will winked, his own dagger resting easy in his palm. "They're fat with pride today," Will murmured, low and close. "Think they'll come singing?" "Pride makes poor armor," Robin replied. His eyes stayed fixed on the bend where the forest path spilled into the clearing. Soon enough, the first wagon appeared, creaking under sacks of barley and grain. Two men rode on its bench, spears resting against their shoulders. Behind it came another wagon, then a third, and finally the sheriff himself, Sir Reginald de Bramber, astride a tall black gelding, his armor polished to a dull gleam beneath his cloak. He rode with a pompous ease, fat fingers gripping the reins as though he held all of Nottinghamshire's hunger in his palm. Robin watched as the lead wagon reached the ford and stopped short at the barricade. Confusion flickered over the driver's face as he tugged the reins, calling to his partner. The horses snorted, stamping in the muddy bank. Sir Reginald rode forward, his voice carrying like a cracked bell. "What's this? Who's laid waste here?" "Move it aside, you dolts!" Two soldiers dismounted, hacking at the branches with dull blades. The moment their backs turned, Robin raised his hand. The signal was small, but in that heartbeat, every hidden outlaw drew breath together. His arrow flew first, cutting the air with a soft hiss. It struck the wooden wheel of the second wagon, splintering the rim and sending the axle into a lurch. Before the startled shouts rose fully, Will's dagger flashed across the clearing, burying itself in the thigh of a guard who toppled with a grunt. Little John surged from the underbrush like a bear roused from sleep, his staff swinging in a wide, perfect arc that caught a soldier square in the ribs. The man folded around the blow, breath gone, blade forgotten. Much and Alan darted to the stalled wagons, slashing open the ropes that bound the sacks of grain. The barley tumbled out in soft, heavy streams, pooling like gold dust at their boots. Friar Tuck brandished his cudgel, swatting aside a lunging spear with a sharp bark of laughter. Sir Reginald tried to wheel his horse around, shouting for his men to form up, but panic had already cracked their line. Arrows fell like rain from the shadows, not to kill, but to scatter and blind. Robin moved among the chaos, loosing shafts with calm precision, each one striking a shield or pinning a cloak to the trunk of a tree. "Hold!" the sheriff roared, his face red with rage. "Stand and fight, you cowards!" But his words fell on empty air. One by one, the sheriff's men fled into the trees, crashing through bramble and brush, dropping shields and spears as they ran. Sir Reginald himself made to spur his gelding into the thicket, but Little John stepped squarely into his path, staff planted across the trail. "Going somewhere, my lord?" John said, voice mild as summer rain. The sheriff's eyes darted, searching for an opening, but Robin appeared beside John, bow drawn, another arrow waiting. "This grain," Robin said evenly, "does not belong to you, Reginald, nor to your king who sleeps while his people starve. It goes back to the villages, every kernel." "You're no better than thieves," the sheriff spat. "Then we are thieves for the poor," Robin replied, "and thieves for the poor fear no king's justice." He gestured to Much, who climbed into the first wagon and flicked the reins. Slowly, the stolen grain rumbled back the way it had come, guided by hands that would feed hungry mouths before nightfall. Alan strummed his lute softly, singing a tune that twined through the clearing like a promise. The greenwood gives, the greenwood guards. Sir Reginald watched helplessly as his prize vanished into the trees. He seethed upon his saddle, his breath ragged with fury. but not a word more passed between him and the outlaws. Robin lowered his bow, turned his back to the sheriff, and disappeared once more into the depths of Sherwood, his band following close behind. By midday, the ford lay empty again, save for the broken branches and a few stray feathers drifting on the breeze. In the heart of the forest, laughter rose beneath the boughs. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that reminds the hungry that hope still walks the woods in the shape of a man with a bow, a band of loyal souls, and the will to stand unbroken. So Sherwood whispered on, and the legend of Robin Hood grew another root deep into England's dreaming earth. The wagons rolled deeper into Sherwood under the careful guidance of Much the miller's son and Allan a Dale. The creak of their wooden wheels mingled with the soft chatter of birds waking to find the forest undisturbed once more. Behind the wagons, Robin and his band moved lightly, eyes alert for any stray scout or foolhardy soldier who might attempt to reclaim what had been stolen from the starving villages. When they reached a clearing hidden behind a thick stand of elder and hawthorn, they stopped. Here, the ground lay soft underfoot, carpeted with last autumn's leaves and new shoots of green. Sunlight dappled through high branches, painting shifting patterns across the wagons and the faces of the men who surrounded them. Little John leaned against one of the wagon wheels, arms folded, watching as Much hopped down from the driver's bench. Much's cheeks were flushed with pride. The raid had been quick, clean, and no good man had fallen. He wiped sweat from his brow with a ragged sleeve. "Well done, lad," Little John said, clapping him on the back so hard that Ariandros. Much staggered forward with a laugh. Nearby, Friar Tuck knelt by the tailgate, untying the cords that bound the sacks of barley and oats. His round face glowed with satisfaction as he inspected the bounty. Grain, salted pork, even a few wheels of hard cheese, all hoarded by the sheriff, now free to fill empty larders. Allan a Dale set his lute aside and perched himself on one of the sacks, humming a lively tune under his breath. He plucked a few notes, letting the melody drift through the clearing like a bird testing its wings. Robin stood apart for a moment, watching his men work. They moved with quiet purpose, laughter rising and falling like the wind through the trees. These men had once been villagers, millers, priests, sons of farmers. Now they were outlaws bound together by hunger and hope. Robin stepped forward, lifting a sack onto his shoulder with practiced ease. He carried it to a patch of flattened grass where Will Scarlet was spreading out a cloth for their midday meal. "Do we feast today, then?" Will asked, grinning as he shook out the cloth. "A feast, yes," Robin said. "But not all for us. By dusk, this grain must find its way to every cottage and croft from Edwinstowe to Clipstone." Will's grin softened into something warmer, and he nodded. "Aye, Robin, we'll see it done." Little John and Much lifted another sack together, setting it down beside a pile of split firewood. Tuck rummaged through his satchel, pulling out a small iron pot and a handful of dried herbs. Soon, a fire crackled in a ring of stones, and the smell of broth and fresh-cut herbs mingled with the sweetness of wood smoke. They sat together as the pot bubbled, passing around pieces of cheese and tearing hunks of bread from a single round loaf. Allan played a gentle tune, the notes low and soft, so as not to carry beyond the sheltering trees. As they ate, the men spoke of the villages that would sleep easier tonight, mothers who would feed their babes, old men who would not go to bed with hollow bellies. They spoke, too, of the sheriff's likely rage, of the fresh patrols that would come crashing through Sherwood with dogs and bribes and sharpened steel. Robin listened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he broke bread and shared it with Much, who wolfed it down between mouthfuls of steaming broth. Between bites, Friar Tuck raised a hand, a scrap of cheese pinched between his fingers. "Let them come, say I. For every spear they carry, the forest hides 1,000 branches ready to crack their pride." Little John laughed at that, a deep, rolling sound that startled a pair of wood pigeons from a nearby bough. "Aye, Tuck. And if branches fail, there's always your holy cudgel to knock sense into them." They all laughed then. Loud, open laughter that stirred the leaves and sent a fox darting through the underbrush. It was a rare sound, that laughter, a thing more precious than silver or stolen gold. In the greenwood, laughter meant freedom, if only for a while. Robin leaned back against the trunk of a sturdy beech, the rough bark pressing cool against his shoulders. He let the warmth of the fire ease the tension in his hands, let the hush of Alan's music weave through the quiet chatter. In that moment, he could almost believe they might always be safe here, hidden beneath the ancient oaks and twisted hazels. But the weight of the stolen grain at his feet reminded him otherwise. This small victory would feed bellies and fan the embers of hope, but it would also stoke the wrath of men who saw Sherwood not as a sanctuary, but as a nest of rebellion, to be smoked out and burned. Still, for now, the danger stayed at bay, caught beyond the hush of trees and the drifting shadows. Robin closed his eyes, listening to the wind stirring through the high canopy. He could smell the wild garlic growing along the stream's edge, hear the soft murmur of Will teasing Alan about a song gone sour, feel the warmth of the fire on his boots. When he opened his eyes again, he found Little John watching him, brow raised. "What do you dream of, Robin?" John asked, voice gentle. Robin took a slow breath, glancing at the wagons stacked with grain. "I dream that one day no man will need to steal what is already his by right." Tuck nodded, lifting his cup in mock salute. "And until that day, we shall feast beneath these boughs and remind the lords that the forest keeps its own justice." They raised their cups together, chipped wooden mugs, battered tin flasks, and drank to the promise of the greenwood. The sun slid westward. The shadows stretched long across the clearing, and the breeze carried their laughter high into the branches where it mingled with the rustle of leaves and the sleepy calls of wood thrushes settling in for the night. And so the outlaws feasted, not in gold-lit halls nor behind stone walls, but in the open embrace of Sherwood, where freedom tasted of wild herbs, warm broth, and bread shared among brothers. Here at least they were kings for a day, and the forest crowned them with its ancient hush. When the meal was done, they packed what remained and doused the fire, leaving no sign but the faint scent of smoke drifting through the twilight. The wagons would roll on at dusk, slipping like ghosts between the trees toward villages that waited in hope and secret gratitude. Above them, the stars began their slow reveal, one by one, as if the sky itself kept watch over Robin Hood and his band. The thieves who gave more than they took. The outlaws who turned hunger into a feast beneath the boughs of England's oldest woods. Night draped itself over Sherwood like a deep woolen cloak, muffling the world in hush and shadow. After the wagons had slipped away toward hungry villages and the last ember of their fire had died in a sigh of sparks, Robin Hood found himself alone beneath the ancient limbs of an old witch elm, listening to the forest breathe. A thin crescent moon climbed above the treetops, pale and watchful, casting silver lacework on the bracken below. The men had drifted off in pairs and small knots, some bedding down near the shallow stream to wash their boots, others vanishing to keep watch on the forest's ragged edges. Even Little John's laughter had faded, replaced by the faint hoot of an owl and the dry rasp of leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Robin sat cross-legged upon a patch of moss, his bow resting across his knees. He turned an arrow over and over in his hands, tracing the fletching with his thumb. In the dimness, the forest seemed endless, a vast cathedral of shadows and moonlight where each creaking branch might be a friend's footstep or an enemy's steel. Though his belly was warm with broth and bread, his mind did not sleep so easily. Each raid, each stolen wagon and scattered patrol bought freedom for a moment, but also painted a brighter target on his back and the backs of all who chose the outlaw's path. Above him, the moon drifted through a tangle of black branches. Once, his mother had called the moon the poor man's lantern, guiding farmers home when work kept them late in the fields. In Locksley, before the outlaw's mantle had settled on his shoulders, Robin had watched that same cold lamp rise over tilled soil and rough stone walls. His father would stand beside him, broad-shouldered and weary, pointing to the silvery light and whispering tales of how Saxon kings of old had marched by moon's glow to keep Norman boots from crushing England's green hills. Those stories lingered in Robin's bones, seeds planted in childhood that had grown wild in the dark soil of injustice. Sometimes he wondered if his father would see him now and smile with pride, or shake his head at a son who chose the forest over hearth and hall. A twig snapped behind him. Quick, light, the step of a friend, not a foe. Robin did not turn. He knew the hush of those footsteps, the careless rhythm of them. A moment later, Will Scarlet eased down beside him, dropping onto the moss with a soft grunt. "Brooding again?" Will asked, plucking at a sprig of heather growing between the roots. "Listening," Robin answered. "The forest says more in silence than men say in words," Will snorted softly. "Aye, well, I've always trusted your ears more than your poetry." He flicked the heather aside, then tugged at the corner of his cloak where a tear showed near the hem. The wagons reached Edwinstowe. Alan saw them to the edge. Mothers wept. They were that glad of the barley. Old Martin the ploughman tried to press him with a jug of cider, but Alan slipped away before he was caught. Robin let out a quiet breath, a small ember of warmth glowing in his chest. "Good. It's why we do this." Will leaned back on his elbows, staring at the moon caught between the branches. His grin softened, turned wistful. "Do you ever think it might be enough? One raid, one wagon, one night when no child goes to sleep hungry." Robin's gaze stayed fixed on the arrow in his hands. "It's never enough. The sheriff will squeeze them harder tomorrow to pay for what we stole today. The king will demand more coin for his endless wars. It's like pouring water into a sieve." "Aye," Will said, his voice gentle. "But tonight the sieve holds, if only for a while. You did that." Robin finally looked at him, studying the familiar smirk that hid more kindness than Will ever admitted. "We did that." Will's grin flashed white in the moonlight. "That we did, cousin, and tomorrow we do it again." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the owl's call drifting low through the trees. Somewhere deeper in the forest, Little John's snore rolled like distant thunder. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of wood sorrel. Robin set the arrow aside and leaned his head back against the elm's broad trunk. The bark pressed rough against his hair, grounding him in the present. This stolen moment of calm between the days of hunger and the days of fight. "When I was a boy," he said, voice soft as the wind, "my mother called the moon the poor man's lantern. She said it watched over those who had no hearth fire to guide them home." Will tilted his head, following Robin's gaze to the thin moon cresting the black canopy. "Seems fitting. We've no roof but branches, no candle but that." Robin's mouth curved into a faint smile. "And yet here, beneath it, I feel closer to home than I ever did behind stone walls." "Aye," Will agreed, eyes drifting half shut. "The forest doesn't care for taxes or titles. It feeds all who listen." They let the silence swell again, easy and full, broken only by the rustle of a fox nosing through bramble in search of a careless mouse. The moon climbed higher, its pale glow gilding the tips of the oaks and the wild tangles of hazel and bracken. In that hush, Robin felt a promise stir within him, not spoken, but woven through bone and breath. A vow that as long as he could lift a bow, draw an arrow, and stand beneath the poor man's lantern, no sheriff's decree or king's tax would go unchallenged. That there would always be grain for the hungry, shelter for the hunted, laughter for the weary, and a greenwood ready to cradle them all. Beside him, Will's head lolled forward, sleep tugging him away into dreams free of sheriffs and gallows. Robin stayed awake a while longer, tracing shapes in the drifting moonlight. When at last his eyes closed, the poor man's lantern watched over him, just as it had watched his father and his father's father before him. An old, silent guardian to all who dared live free beneath the endless sky. Dawn broke slow and reluctant over Nottinghamshire, dragging a grey veil of mist across fields and hedgerows. In the sheriff's manor, the hearth fire had burned low, yet heat still smouldered in the great hall. Not from flame alone, but from the rage of Sir Reginald de Bramber, Sheriff of Nottingham. He sat at the high table beneath a tapestry of hunting hounds and crowned stags, his thick fingers drumming on the polished oak. The hall smelled of old smoke, sweat, and the faint iron tang of chainmail drying by the fire. At his elbow lay an untouched trencher of bread and salted venison. His appetite had fled in the night when word reached him that his wagons, the king's grain, as he called it, had vanished into Sherwood's green jaws. Before him stood Sir Guy of Gisborne, lean and wolfish in leather and mail. Sir Guy watched the sheriff with a predator's patience, dark eyes glinting beneath a fall of tangled hair. At his hip hung a sword newly honed, its hilt wound in black leather. "They laughed at you," the sheriff spat, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night. That wretch and his filthy band of hedge-born thieves. They mocked my seal, overturned my wagons, Sir Guy, and the king's tithe with them. Sir Guy inclined his head, more shadow than man in the half-light. They are not ghosts, my lord. They bleed as any man does. You have starved them, hunted them, driven them to the bracken like foxes. Yet still, they snap at your throat. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He hated the truth when spoken so coldly. He snatched a silver goblet from the table and drank deep, wine spilling into his beard. Then cut out their teeth, he snarled. Break their jaws so they snap no more. Sir Guy let the insult pass over him like rain on a cloak. He stepped forward, laying a rolled scrap of parchment on the table. The sheriff snatched it up with meaty fingers, unrolling it so hard the wax seal snapped in two. On the parchment was a crude map, a tangled knot of tracks and trails winding through Sherwood, inked with marks where travelers had vanished, wagons had emptied, or soldiers had never returned. Your traps fail because they hunt shadows, Sir Guy said. But shadows move along roots and water. These paths here, the old poacher's runs, the Roman ditches, the deer tracks, they are Robin Hood's veins. Block them, poison them, and the outlaw's heart stops beating. The sheriff glared at the map, though the lines blurred with his fury. You speak as though he were no mere man, but the forest itself. Sir Guy's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. A man becomes the forest when the forest shelters him, so we strip the forest bare. He paced to the hearth, planting one booted foot on the cold stones. Sparks drifted up as he kicked at the embers. We send word to every crofter and forester within 5 leagues. They bring hounds, they bring axes. We cut trails through the brush wide enough for a cart and 3 men abreast. We burn their brambles, smoke out their burrows, and when they run, we catch them in the open. The sheriff finished, breathing heavy, and hang them from their own oaks. Sir Guy nodded once, a predator's promise glinting in his gaze. He turned back to the table, tapping the map with a scarred finger. Give me men, coin, and free rein to do as I see fit. No patrols wandering blind. No slow-witted bailiffs bribed with cider and pies. I need men who know how to track wolves, not sheep. You shall have them, the sheriff growled. And more. Double wages for any man who brings me Robin Hood's head. Triple if he comes alive and kneels before me in chains. A stir passed through the shadows at the edge of the hall. A cluster of guards and servants who had crept close enough to hear. Rumors spread like sparks on dry straw. Some would carry word to the villages before dusk, warning mothers to hush their children's songs of Robin's greenwood crown. Others would whisper it to Robin's own ears, whether they meant to or not. Sir Guy leaned closer, lowering his voice so only the sheriff heard. When the people see your rope around his throat, they will kneel to you as they kneel to the king. No more ballads at hearth fires. No more coins dropped into secret hands. You will own every branch of Sherwood, and every soul who hides beneath it. The sheriff sat back, the promise blooming in his mind like sour wine. He saw himself riding through Nottingham's gates, Robin's broken body slung over a horse, his name spat in fear instead of sung in alleys. He saw the king's favor, perhaps even lands further north, coin enough to drown the last complaint from starving peasants. Go, he rasped, voice thick with hunger, not for food, but for vengeance. Loose your hounds, smoke out your fox, bring me the outlaw's head. Sir Guy of Gisborne bowed low, cloak sweeping the rushes on the floor. When he rose, his eyes gleamed in the fire's flicker, a reflection of a man who hunted not for coin alone, but for the thrill of the snare and the snap of jaws closing on a desperate thing. Outside the manor, dawn bled fully into day. Thin rays of sun fell upon the village where mothers stirred thin porridge for hungry children, and fathers rose stiff from pallets of straw to face another day beneath the king's tithe. In the hedgerows and along muddy lanes, whispers already drifted, of wagons returned, bellies filled, and the sheriff's fury brewing like a storm on the horizon. And far beyond, beneath the waking boughs of Sherwood, Robin Hood stirred from a half-sleep, the poor man's lantern long vanished behind gathering clouds. Somewhere deep within, a chill pricked at his bones, a whisper that the forest's hush was about to be shattered by the thunder of hounds and the hiss of steel. For in the sheriff's hall, wrath had been loosed, and in the greenwood, a legend would need every shadow, every leaf, and every loyal heart to survive the hunt now coming for his head. In the hush between dawn and full morning, the forest felt like a church of shadows and drifting birdsong. High in the canopy, a woodpecker hammered at dead bark, sending echoes down to the mossy floor where Robin Hood crouched with Gwest, Much the miller's son at his side. Robin's eyes were fixed on a line of footprints pressed into the damp earth. Deer at first glance, but the spacing told another story. Men pretending to be deer, boots wrapped in rags to muffle their steps, moving where only animals should tread. He brushed his fingertips over the deepest print and frowned. Poachers? Much asked, leaning close enough that his breath stirred the leaves. No, Robin said softly. Sheriff's men? Sir Guy's by the look of it. Much's eyes widened, and he pushed back his hood, revealing hair the color of fresh straw, matted with bramble seeds. Already? We only took those wagons 2 nights past. Robin rose, scanning the hush of hazel and oak, the bracken trembling with a breeze that smelled faintly of smoke. Word travels faster than coin. The sheriff means to burn us out, much. They moved through the trees in silence, feet falling where moss cushioned their tread. Every few paces, Robin paused to touch bark or kneel at a broken twig, reading the signs as if the forest whispered to him alone. A jay scolded them from overhead, flitting branch to branch in restless circles. Somewhere behind, a distant dog barked once. Too far to be clear, but enough to quicken Robin's pace. At a narrow stream, they found Alan a Dale waiting, perched on a smooth stone mid-current, lute cradled on his knee like a sleeping child. He looked up as they approached, eyes sharp beneath his shag of wind-blown hair. "Did you see them?" Alan asked without greeting. He strummed a single note, the sound thin and bright in the hush. "We found their tracks," Robin said. "How many?" Alan let his fingers dance along the strings, half music, half nerves. "A dozen with hounds, maybe more. I heard them down by the old charcoal pit. They've got torches ready to light the brush." Much's face paled. "They'll smoke us out like badgers in a hole." Robin placed a hand on Much's shoulder. "Then we move the hole." Alan lifted his chin. "I've word from Edwinstowe, too. The miller's daughter says the sheriff's men are forcing folk to gather wood for the burning. They'll make the villages do their dirty work if they can." Robin's jaw tightened, and for a moment he stood utterly still. The forest hummed around him. A thrush called from somewhere unseen, the stream murmured at his boots. But his thoughts roared louder. He saw families pressed to haul brush, children pushed ahead of armored men, smoke rising from the very roots that had hidden him since the first day he fled a lord's decree. "They think fear will break the bond between us and the villages," he said at last. "They think if they make honest folk bear the flame, Sherwood will hand us over to spare itself the burn." Alan's music stilled, the final note hanging brittle in the soft morning air. "Will it?" Robin met his gaze, calm but iron beneath. "No. The forest has more paths than they have torches, and good hearts will always find them." He motioned for Alan to shoulder his lute. Together they moved deeper into the wood, following a game trail that twisted beneath old hazel arches and fallen limbs. Now and then Robin reached up to snap a small branch here, bend a fresh shoot there. Tiny signs only his band would understand. A broken sprig pointed east to safety. A cut reed marked a hidden turn. They came upon Will Scarlet and Little John near a ring of old standing stones, moss-grown and half-buried in bracken. Will was pacing, blades glinting at each hip. Little John leaned against a stone with his arms folded, eyes calm as rain. "You've heard?" Robin asked without preamble. Will shrugged, the motion sharp. "Aye, dogs sniffing round Widow's Hollow, lads with pikes down by Friar's Creek. They're sweeping from all sides, hoping we'll panic." Little John pushed off the stone, towering over them all. "Then we do not panic," he said, voice quiet and certain. "The forest favors patience. Let Sir Guy thrash his hounds through the underbrush. We are the underbrush." Robin almost smiled at that. He glanced at Alan, who dropped a hand to the lute and picked out a single sly tune, a sly fox slipping through farmers' fields. The sound made Will's grin flicker back into place. "Much, take word to Tuck," Robin said. "Tell him to scatter the families deeper into the old charcoal pits. If Sir Guy thinks smoke will flush us, he'll find only damp bracken and empty burrows." Much nodded, already slipping off into the green gloom, light as a wisp. Robin turned to the others, tracing a line in the dirt with the tip of an arrow. We stay in pairs. We strike where they grow careless, cut their boots from beneath them, lead them in circles until their bellies grumble and their dogs lose the scent. By nightfall, we'll leave them so lost they'll beg the dark for mercy. Will's grin turned wicked. And what if Sir Guy himself blunders into our snare? Robin's eyes glinted under the shifting canopy. Then Sherwood keeps a trophy. They broke apart like mist at dawn, each man vanishing into the hush between bramble and ash. In the stillness left behind, the standing stones seemed to lean closer, as if listening to the promise carried on the wind, that no fire, no hound, no knight's iron vow could smother the greenwood's heart. Far off, the sheriff's men pressed deeper into Sherwood, torches sputtering in the damp air, hounds baying at shadows. But Robin Hood's paths twisted like roots beneath them, unseen, unbroken, waiting for the careless step that would remind them all that the forest's true master wore no crown, but the whispering leaves above his head. By late afternoon, Sherwood glowed with a haze of golden mist. The sun slanted through ancient oaks and beeches, setting the leaves aflame in shifting shades of green and gold. Somewhere deeper in the thickets, the barking of hounds rose and fell, a distant threat that stirred the smaller creatures into silence and sent shadows slipping between roots. Robin moved like the dusk itself, silent and certain. Beside him, Will Scarlet crouched low behind a tangle of bramble, peering through a gap where the old Roman track cut through the forest's edge. The track was little more than a memory now, stone swallowed by moss, flanked by stubborn hawthorn and gorse. But it was the kind of path Sir Guy would trust, old and straight, fit for horses and iron-shod boots. They watched as the first riders appeared, 6 men on lean mounts, their surcoats dusty, their spears catching shards of late sun. Behind them padded 3 lean hounds, snouts low to the ground, tails flicking through ferns. And then came Sir Guy himself. He rode a dark roan, its flanks streaked with sweat. He wore no grand crest, only a simple leather breastplate and a hood pushed back to let his black hair fall loose about his shoulders. His eyes moved ceaselessly over the trees, the bramble, the scattered traces of animal trails. Every so often, he raised a gloved hand and his men fanned wider, pushing the hounds to sniff deeper into the underbrush. "He hunts as if he's part wolf," Will whispered, his grin sharp at the edges. Robin's reply was a soft breath. "Even wolves can be led into snares." From his satchel, Robin pulled a coil of thin rope and a pouch of fine ash. Will watched as Robin dipped his fingers in the ash and flicked it into the faint breeze. It drifted, gray and subtle, coating a patch of bracken near the path. The ash carried the faint scent of roasted meat, enough to confuse a hound's nose for a few heartbeats, enough to make them turn where Robin wished. He handed Will the coil of rope. "Up there," Robin said, pointing to a sturdy limb above the track. Will's eyes flicked upward, then back to Robin's face, and he grinned wider, teeth bright in the green dusk. Without a sound, Will slipped into the branches, climbing swift as a cat. Robin pressed lower into the bramble, the thorns scratching at his tunic as he waited. The riders drew closer. The hounds halted at the patch of ash, noses twitching, tails stiff. They circled once, twice, puzzled, then surged left into a gap between old birches where a game trail ran narrow and deep. Sir Guy reined in sharply, eyes narrowing as his horse sidestepped the hound's sudden frenzy. Robin watched as the riders followed, ducking low under drooping hazel. Sir Guy lingered a moment longer, scanning the shadows with a hunter's suspicion. The forest breathed around him, birds stilled, leaves quivered, but nothing moved that did not belong. Then, with a low hiss to his horse, Sir Guy pressed on after his men. Robin counted his heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. He slipped from the bramble and stepped lightly onto the track, eyes on Will above. Will's rope hung loose, looped and ready. In the hush of falling dusk, Robin drew his bow, nocking an arrow but not pulling yet. The first hound broke through the underbrush again, confused, whining at the sudden dead end of scent. The men called back to Sir Guy, who turned his horse and trotted forward to see the trouble himself. His eyes fell on the game trail, then lifted, just as Will let the rope drop. It fell clean and quick, a loop closing about the narrow track. Sir Guy's horse stepped forward, hooves catching the snare. With a sharp tug from Will above, the loop cinched tight about the animal's forelegs. The roan reared with a shriek of protest, throwing Sir Guy sideways into the bracken. Robin's arrow sang before Sir Guy could right himself. It struck the ground a hair's breadth from the knight's gloved hand, quivering in the moss like a silent threat. Sir Guy froze. His men turned too late, half-trapped in the brush, caught between the hound's confusion and the sudden break of their master's calm. Robin stepped into view, bow lowered but ready, his shadow long in the last slice of light. Will dropped lightly from the tree, landing beside him with a soft thud. "Evening, Sir Guy," Robin said, voice calm as still water. "The forest bids you welcome." Sir Guy rose slowly, brushing leaves from his cloak. His dark eyes flicked from Robin's bow to Will's easy grin, then to the rope snare that still tangled his horse's trembling legs. "Clever," he said, his voice rough as bark. "A trick for children and foxes." "For children and foxes, and wolves that forget they bleed like men," Robin answered. One of the sheriff's men started to raise his spear. Will's blade flashed out, its tip resting light against the man's throat, before the threat could grow teeth. The rider froze, hands lifting from the haft. Robin stepped closer, closing the space between him and Sir Guy, until only the hush of dusk lay between them. "You burn my woods, you send good folk to gather brush for your torches, you'd starve the very roots you stand on." Robin's voice stayed soft, but each word was a blade drawn slow. "Why serve a man who taxes your own children into rags, Sir Guy?" Sir Guy's smile was a thin white line. "A man serves power, Robin of Locksley, not children's dreams." Robin nodded once, as if he pitied him. Then he turned, signaling Will with the smallest flick of his fingers. In a breath, Will pulled the rope free. The snare loosened, the roan bolted into the trees, scattering Sir Guy's men, who scrambled to catch reins and hounds alike. Robin melted into the shadows before Sir Guy could bark his rage, Will at his side, laughter quiet as a ghost behind his teeth. By the time Sir Guy rose again, alone among the startled hounds and his scattered men, Sherwood had swallowed its outlaws once more. Only the ash on the trail and the echo of mocking laughter in the trees marked where the hunter had become the hunted, and where the greenwood's shadows still belonged to Robin Hood. Deep within the oldest heart of Sherwood lay a place few men had ever seen, a hollow glade where the trees grew so thick and close that even midday sun slipped through in trembling threads like candlelight caught between cathedral pillars. It was here, beneath roots older than the memory of kings, that Robin Hood led his band after the snare for Sir Guy. The forest had hushed around them, holding its breath after the laughter faded, and the hoofbeats of Sir Guy's scattered hunt faded eastward. Robin moved ahead, brushing past bracken and tangled hazel, boots silent on the mossy earth. Behind him came Will Scarlet, still grinning at the thought of Sir Guy on his back in the ferns, and Allan a Dale, carrying his lute like a priest his book of psalms. They slipped through a narrow cleft between two ancient beeches, where the earth dipped into a bowl-like hollow hidden from wandering eyes. Here the air smelled of damp stone and wild garlic, and the canopy overhead knit so tight that not even the moonlight found easy passage. Little John and Friar Tuck waited there already. They had arrived ahead of the others, guarding this secret as fiercely as the forest guarded them. Tuck leaned against a split trunk, eyes half closed, murmuring a prayer that sounded more like a lullaby than a sermon. Beside him, Little John whittled a staff from an ash branch, curls of pale wood littering his boots. Robin stepped into the clearing and felt the hush settle about his shoulders, a cool weight like an old cloak. He paused to rest his palm against the massive trunk of an oak at the glade's center, a tree so broad that 5 men could not link hands around it. Beneath its roots lay Sherwood's best-kept secret, a hidden hollow where the outlaws could gather when the hunt pressed too close, where grain and bows, fletchings and salted meat lay safe from fire and greedy men. Will tossed his cloak onto a patch of dry leaves and flopped down beside Tuck. "Our wolf lord didn't take kindly to being caught like a farmyard hare," he said with a grin. "He'll ride back to the sheriff snarling." "Let him snarl," Tuck said, pushing himself upright. He patted his round belly as if it were a drum. "The more noise they make, the more they show their fear. Fear is our ally." Allan settled near the oak's roots, plucking at his lute, shaping soft chords that drifted through the hollow like mist. "A song about a knight caught in a bramble snare," he murmured. Might be worth a verse or two at the next village gathering. Little John looked up from his carving, his broad face creased in a smile. Make him handsomer than he is. No one will believe a tale of Sir Guy's sharp looks. Alan chuckled, and the notes of his lute danced brighter for a moment. Robin crouched at the base of the oak, brushing aside fallen leaves and moss, until his fingers found the edge of an old trapdoor, rough-hewn and bound in iron. He lifted it carefully, revealing a dark hollow beneath the tree's massive roots. The earth inside was dry and cool, lined with stone and scraps of cloth. Bundles of arrows lay stacked beside salted meat, wrapped in waxed linen. A battered chest held coin enough to bribe a bailiff or feed a family through a harsh winter. Much the miller's son appeared through the bracken, cheeks flushed, hair wild with twigs caught in it. He carried a sack of fresh-gathered mushrooms slung over his shoulder, his eyes bright with news. They've turned back from the charcoal pits, Much said breathlessly. The villagers wouldn't guide them. They tried to press old Martin, but he spat at Sir Guy's boots. They'll ride for the manor before sunset. Robin's mouth curved, though the smile did not reach his eyes. Good folk stand fast when they know they're not alone. Will glanced at the trapdoor, then back at Robin. How long do we stay burrowed under this old oak? Robin's fingers drummed once on the edge of the hidden hollow. Not long. By dawn, Sir Guy's men will be exhausted, their hounds muddied and hungry. While they sleep, we move the grain stores from Widow's Hollow and see them safe to the villages beyond the sheriff's reach. Little John's staff split cleanly beneath his knife, the fresh wood pale as milk. He blew the shavings from his lap. Another mouthful stolen back from the crown, he said. Another promise kept. Tuck shuffled over to the open hollow, peering in with a fond eye. Strange, isn't it? A hole in the ground becomes a chapel if the right men gather there. A church with no stone, no cross, just the roots of an old tree, and the vows we whisper when no lord listens. Alan's fingers stilled on his lute strings. For a heartbeat, the clearing fell utterly silent, but for the slow drip of water somewhere deep beneath the roots. Robin lowered the trapdoor gently, covering their hidden store once more. This forest keeps us, he said, as long as we remember why it does. Outside the glade, the wind stirred, rustling through the leaves like soft laughter. Somewhere in the dusk, an owl called, a single note that echoed off bark and stone, a reminder that even in the dark, eyes watched and wings waited. Much dropped to the ground with a sigh, spilling mushrooms into his lap. If we're to stay the night here, he said, someone best see to supper. Friar Tuck rumbled a laugh and clapped him, Much on the shoulder. I'll turn your mushrooms into a miracle, boy. And tomorrow, we'll feed the poor another slice of the sheriff's stolen pie. Robin leaned back against the great oak, listening to Alan's gentle tune, to Will's easy banter with John, to Tuck's humming as he sorted mushrooms from bracken. For a moment, the forest felt unbreakable, a living shield of leaf and root and loyal hearts stronger than iron or coin. Above, the canopy trembled as the wind changed, carrying the hush of distant threats and distant hope alike. And beneath the roots, safe for now in their hidden hollow, Robin Hood's vow held fast, that no tyrant's fire would ever burn all the secrets the greenwood kept safe in its deep, dreaming heart. Night slipped softly from the glade beneath the old oak, leaving behind the warmth of shared bread and the hush of low songs. By dawn, Robin Hood and his band had slipped once more into the tangled veins of Sherwood, moving like ghosts through bracken and birch. Above, the sky bloomed pale gold, streaked with drifting wisps of smoke that did not belong to any cookfire. Robin saw it first, a thin column rising beyond the oaks, too wide, too dark for hearth or kiln. He halted on a narrow game trail, hand lifted to still the rustling footsteps behind him, while Scarlet drew up beside him, nose wrinkling as the first acrid taste of burning thatch reached them on the breeze. That's not charcoal, Will said, voice flat. Robin shook his head, jaw tight. No, that's Edwinstowe. They moved faster then, feet silent over the dew-wet moss, breath clouding in the early chill. When they reached the edge of the forest, they crouched in the shadows of a broken hedge, peering out over a small clearing where the village of Edwinstowe huddled in a hollow of fields and stone walls. Where once low cottages huddled under thatched roofs and curling wood smoke, now stood smoldering ruin. 2 roofs had collapsed already, skeletal beams jutting at the dawn like blackened ribs. Villagers stood in clusters at the edge of the green, arms wrapped tight about shoulders and children alike. A few carried buckets, but the fire had mostly spent itself in the night, leaving behind ruin that smelled of scorched rye and damp, bitter smoke. At the far end of the green, Sir Guy of Gisborne sat astride his roan, the same beast that had fled Robin's snare only days before. His men fanned out behind him, some standing guard with pikes set like fence posts, others nudging through the ashes with iron-tipped staves, prodding the charred timbers for signs of hidden stores. Robin's eyes narrowed. There were no screams, no fresh cries, only the dull, raw silence of people who had already wept all their tears before dawn. Will's breath hissed through his teeth. "The Black Wolf tries to break their backs," he said low. "Burn their roof, burn their belly, see if they'll ever lift a hand for the greenwood again." Robin's eyes swept the green. Beside a half-burnt cottage knelt old Nan, the same woman who had wept when the sheriff's men took her barley days ago. Her thin shoulders shook as she tried to rake aside embers with a cracked broom handle. A girl of no more than 10 hovered behind her, bare feet black with soot, eyes wide and empty. Will's fingers twitched at the hilt of his dagger. "One arrow, Rob. One. I can put it through his neck from here." Robin placed a hand on Will's wrist. "No." His voice was soft but steel-bound. "A dead wolf spooks the pack into panic. Let him think we're blind to this. For now." Will glared at him, but his hand fell away from his blade. Together they watched as Sir Guy dismounted, boots crunching over the frost-hardened earth. He spoke with the village reeve, a stooped man who flinched at every gesture of the knight's gauntleted hand. Though they could not hear his words from the hedge, they knew the shape of the threat. "Yield the outlaws, or yield your roof and your children's supper." The same bargain in every village, as old as iron coin and sharper than any king's decree. Robin slipped back into the shadows. Will followed, his anger coiled tight in every step. They found Alan waiting by the bend in the track, his lute slung over one shoulder, his eyes dark with worry. "They fired 2 barns before dawn," Alan said, voice hushed. "Told them more would burn if the greenwood didn't hand itself over by Michaelmas." "They're frightened, Robin. And when folk get frightened enough, they'll talk." Robin knelt, pulling aside a tuft of last year's bracken to draw a quick mark in the dirt. A line for the forest's edge, a curve for the village green. A cross for the patrol routes Sir Guy's men would ride in the days to come. "We'll not let them break," Robin said. "Tonight we move the children to Friar Tuck's old hermitage near the western hollow. Grain, too. Whatever hasn't turned to ash. Alan, you take word to John. He'll find carts and strong arms to carry what's left." Will crouched beside him, watching the rough plan take shape. "And Sir Guy?" Robin's smile was a ghost, thin, cold, dangerous. "Sir Guy wants fear. We'll give him something else to chew on. He'll think we run like cornered hares. Instead, we'll slip past his teeth and steal the meat from his table." Alan gave a short, sharp nod and vanished back into the trees. Will lingered, resting his weight on his heels, eyes still fixed on the thin column of smoke rising above the hedge. "They trust you," he said after a moment, his voice lower, the heat gone soft and tired. "Even when the sky turns black, you think you'll always keep that trust?" Robin's fingers brushed the mark in the earth, smudging the plan back into the moss and soil. "Not always," he said, "but tonight will not be the night we lose it." Will stood, tugging his hood low as the wind shifted the smoke eastward. "Then lead on, cousin, the forest waits." Together they slipped back into the hush of Sherwood, where the bracken swallowed their shapes and the hawthorn bent low to hide their passing. Behind them, the village smoldered under the pale dawn, but beneath the roots, beneath the hush of ancient boughs, hope still moved like a heartbeat. So the fire that Sir Guy lit would not stay chained to fear alone. Robin Hood would carry its embers back into the greenwood, not to burn fields, but to light every hidden trail and secret burrow where the outlaw's promise still glowed, bright as the first spark struck against a forest's waiting dark. By the time dusk laid its purple cloak across Sherwood, Robin Hood and his band were already deep among paths that few but the oldest charcoal burners and deer keepers remembered. Beneath the hush of the settling night, carts creaked low between elder hedges, drawn by weary village oxen that had seen too many seasons and too little hay. Bundled close within the wagons sat children and old folk, blankets wrapped tight around thin shoulders, eyes wide and silent in the drifting lantern glow. At the head of this hidden procession rode Little John. He walked ahead with his staff slung across his broad shoulders like a soldier's spear. His steps broke no twig, for even in size he moved lighter than fear itself. Beside the last wagon, Alan-a-Dale guided the oxen with quiet murmurs, his lute slung at his back. Now and then he hummed a soft tune, low enough to calm restless heads, half dozing among straw and sacks of salvaged barley. Robin moved among them all like a wraith. A hand here on a shoulder, a whispered promise there for a frightened child. He felt the hush in these good folk, the same hush that trembled in him each time he glimpsed the glow of fresh embers where a cottage once stood. But for now, they had outrun the smoke. The old hermitage waited for them in a sunken hollow near the western edge of Sherwood. Long before Robin's time, a hermit monk had dug his cell into the side of a gentle slope, bracing the roof with stout timber beams and the root-tangled ribs of a great ash tree. When the hermit passed, his prayers drifted up through the soil and vanished, but the hollow remained, a secret sanctuary woven into the forest's deep memory. It was Friar Tuck who rediscovered it, years before he ever wore an outlaw's grin. When he arrived ahead of the wagons this night, he knelt in the old doorway, clearing bramble and dead leaves with broad sweeps of his arm. He hummed psalms between grunts, as though to remind the walls of their holier days. Inside, the earthen room smelled of damp wood, clay, and the faint ghost of incense. Or perhaps that was just the friar's kindly breath. When the first cart reached the hollow, Tuck stepped forward and lifted a pale-faced boy into his arms. "Mind the door, lad," he rumbled gently. "This house bows low to saints and sinners alike." He set the child down on a straw pallet laid against the wall, where the earth dipped and stayed dry through rain or frost. One by one, the children and elders climbed down, blinking at the torchlight flickering on the earthen walls. Mothers gathered close, wrapping arms around little ones who had fallen asleep in the wagon's rocking. Old Martin the plowman leaned on a pitchfork, his knees stiff from nights sleeping by burned beams. He caught Robin's eye and managed the ghost of a smile. "Never thought I'd be hid like a fox in a hole," Martin rasped. "But I reckon this hole's warmer than Sir Guy's gallows." "It's warm enough," Robin said, gripping the old man's arm with care. "And while Sherwood breathes, so do you." Outside, Will Scarlet and Much the miller's son unloaded what they could salvage. Rough sacks of barley, 2 wheels of blackened cheese that had survived the barn's smoldering ruin, and a battered iron pot still good for boiling a stew. Will found a corner of the hollow where the roof rose highest and set a small brazier crackling to life. He fed it kindling and watched the embers glow like watchful eyes. Friar Tuck produced from his satchel a twist of herbs and a handful of dried peas. Soon the pot bubbled with a thin, honest broth that smelled of garlic and sage. The steam wove its way through the hollow, easing the shivers from shoulders and the silence from tired tongues. Alan perched near the door, his back against the rough lintel, lute resting on his knee. His fingers wandered the strings in slow ripples, a lullaby drifting soft as breath. Little John moved among the folk, passing bread broken by his own big hands, pouring ladlefuls of Tuck's stew into waiting bowls. Robin stepped outside the hollow for a moment, letting the hush of the clearing wrap around him. The night pressed close, damp with the promise of rain. Somewhere above the canopy, a barn owl called, its soft voice a ghost's sigh in the hush. Robin's eyes traced the tree line, seeing no torchlight yet, no steel glinting where it should not. Will joined him at the threshold, arms folded, breath misting in the cold. "They'll come sniffing for us," he said. "Sir Guy's too proud to let this slip." Robin nodded. "He'll find the village empty of children and the old. No easy hostages left to squeeze. By the time he searches the West Hollow, we'll be gone again." "Always gone," Will murmured, not quite a question nor a complaint. Robin looked at him then, saw not just the smirk and dagger-quick grin, but the man beneath, tired and loyal, carrying this forest in the marrow of his bones. "We'll not run forever," Robin said softly. "One day they'll tire of wasting flame and coin on shadows." Will's laugh was soft, sharp. "Or we'll burn their gold and their gallows alike, and then rest at last under an honest roof." Robin's mouth curved, though no one could tell if it was truly a smile. He clapped Will's shoulder once, a brief anchor in the hush. Then he turned back to the hollow, ducking through the low doorway to where warmth glowed against the clay walls, and the children's soft breathing rose above Alan's drifting tune. Outside, the rain began to whisper through the canopy, a steady hush that washed the scent of smoke from hair and cloak alike. Beneath the roots of Sherwood, the outlaws held their hidden vigil, not only for themselves, but for every empty hearth and hushed voice that still dreamed of bread on the table, a roof unburned, and the freedom that waited, stubborn as green shoots beneath winter's frost. And so the hermitage stood that night, a refuge dug into England's dreaming bones. Proof that no matter how hard Sir Guy's fire burned, the greenwood's heart still kept a spark the wind could never find. Morning in the western hollow arrived, hidden in drizzle and drifting mist, the forest floor soft with rain that muffled footsteps and blurred the line between earth and sky. The old hermitage, with its clay walls and bramble-tangled roof, held the outlaws and their guests in a hush, broken only by the scrape of ladles and the low murmur of Alan's soft song. By dawn, Robin was already gone from the hollow, slipping through the wet hush with Will Scarlet at his shoulder. Where the oaks grew thickest and the fox tracks crossed old charcoal pits, they found the hidden deer path that led north toward the Widow's Hollow, a place spoken of in whispers among Sherwood's poor. Will pulled his cloak tighter, droplets sliding from the hood to his nose. "Remind me again why we visit a widow who's half fable, half threat." Robin moved ahead, brushing aside a branch heavy with rain. Because sometimes fables feed more mouths than truth. They pressed on until the hush of the trees opened into a clearing where the earth dipped into a shallow basin, rimmed with hazel and gnarled thorn. In its center stood a cottage no bigger than a charcoal shed, its walls patchwork wattle, roof lost beneath a riot of moss and creeping ivy. Smoke rose pale and thin from a hole in the roof, curling into the drizzle like a thread trying to stitch the forest to the sky. No birds sang here. Even the wind seemed to hush itself as they stepped closer. Will muttered under his breath, "The Widow's Hollow. More crows than neighbors." Robin raised a hand for silence. He stepped forward alone, boots sinking into soft moss. At the door, a slab of bark bound with leather thongs, he knocked 3 times, slow and sure. For a breath, nothing answered but the patter of rain on leaves. Then the door cracked open, and a pair of eyes peered out, dark as brambleberries, sharp as a hawk's. The face behind them was lined with age, framed by a gray scarf that vanished into a mass of uncombed hair. "You come quiet enough for thieves," the woman said, voice rasped by smoke and years. "We come quiet enough for friends," Robin replied, meeting her gaze steady. She opened the door wider, and the smell of dried herbs and damp peat drifted out, mingling with the forest's rain-sweet breath. She stepped aside, crooked fingers motioning them in. The inside of the cottage was more root than wall. Baskets of nettle and marjoram hung from beams. Bunches of garlic and dry wild onions swung above a low hearth where embers glowed red as fox eyes. In the corner, 3 hens clucked softly in a wicker pen. A black cat slumbered on a pile of old sacks, tail flicking when the door closed behind them. The widow, none called her by any other name, lowered herself onto a rough stool beside the hearth. Her eyes never left Robin's face. "You raid the king's wagons, you bait the sheriff's wolves, and now you stand in my door in the drizzle. What bone do you wish to bury in my hollow?" Robin slipped off his hood, letting the rain drip from his hair onto the earthen floor. "No bone, mistress, only a favor." Will leaned near the hearth, warming his hands against the red coals. He eyed the widow's watchful cat, which eyed him back as if weighing his worth in mouse bones. The widow's thin lips twitched into something like a smile. "A favor from me is never free, Robin of Locksley." Robin nodded once. "Nor should it be." He reached into his cloak and drew out a small sack. When he placed it on the hearthstone, the faint clink of coin stirred the hens to restless pecking. The widow made no move to touch it. "Silver can't mend burned thatch," she rasped, "nor fill the granaries Sir Guy emptied." "It's not to buy your mercy," Robin said. "It's to keep the hollow safe while my people pass through." The widow tilted her head, sharp eyes narrowing. "Pass through?" Robin lowered himself onto one knee before the hearth, so his eyes met hers level across the fire's glow. "Sir Guy hunts us with dogs and bribes. He will burn the forest if he thinks he can trap us like stoats in a burrow. Tonight we move what we must. Grain, children, the old and the sick. If the sheriff's men look to the roads, we need paths they'd never guess. We need the hollow. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hiss of rain on the mossy roof and the cluck of the hens shifting straw. The widow reached for a gnarled stick and stirred the embers as if seeking an omen in their flicker. At last she spoke. This forest remembers 100 kings and forgets none. I'll grant you this path. But if your mischief brings fire to my door, Robin Hood, I'll send curses down your line until your grandsons wear rags for skin. Robin bowed his head, grave and grateful all at once. No harm shall come to your door, nor your hens, nor the bones you bury beneath your roof. The widow's thin mouth twitched again. See that it doesn't. She pushed herself to standing and shuffled to a rough shelf stacked with jars and scraps of waxed cloth. From a knot of dry nettle she drew a twist of pale string, flecked with ash. She handed it to Robin. Lay this on the path west of your hollow when you leave tonight, she said. Where this hangs, no dog will nose your track. Where it falls, the trees will swallow your prints like rain in sand. Robin took the charm, pressing it to his lips as one might kiss a relic. You have my vow. Will straightened, pulling his hood back up with a wry grin. Blessed by brambles and old bones, maybe the rain will even favor us now. The widow snorted, waving them off with a flick of her wrist. The rain favors no man. It favors the roots. When they stepped back into the clearing, drizzle still falling soft as a whisper, Robin tucked the widow's charm close to his chest. In the hush beneath the thorn trees, he felt Sherwood's secrets shift like sleeping foxes, restless but ready. They moved off through the bracken again, vanishing into the mist like breath swallowed by the waking green. And behind them, the widow's door closed with a soft thud. A promise that so long as the forest kept its secrets, Robin Hood's path would stay hidden beneath roots too old and wild for any sheriff's fire to find. Evening drew its slow gray curtain over Sherwood, as Robin and Will returned to the hidden hollow where the hermitage kept its flickering warmth alive. The hush of the rain had settled into a patient drizzle, drumming soft rhythms on leaves and the patchwork roof above the clay refuge. Inside, the children slept in bundles of borrowed blankets, breath rising in little clouds beneath the flickering brazier's glow. Alan Adale was the first to meet them as they slipped through the low doorway. His eyes flicked from Robin's damp cloak to the ash-flecked charm he now carried tight in one hand. "So the widow gave you her blessing," Alan said, voice pitched low so as not to wake the restless dreamers curled at his feet. Will brushed past him, dropping onto an upturned bucket by the hearth. A blessing or a threat, depending on how polite we stay. Robin handed the charm to Friar Tuck, who turned it over in the light, his broad fingers surprisingly gentle on the brittle nettle stalks bound in ash-lace twine. Tuck muttered a quiet prayer under his breath, half jest, half thanks, then tucked the charm away in the pouch at his belt. "She gave us more than I'd hoped for," Robin said. He crouched near the coals, warming his raw hands over the faint heat. "We lay her token on the western track at dusk. Any hound Sir Guy sets loose will lose our scent where the charm falls." Little John emerged from the shadows behind them, stooping beneath the low roof beam. He carried a sack of fresh kindling slung over one shoulder, its damp sticks crackling as he set them beside the hearth. "I've spread word among the charcoal pits," John said. "If Sir Guy pushes west, the old burners will steer him in circles till his boots wear thin." Alan perched on the edge of a straw pallet, tuning his lute with soft, ghost-like plucks. "He'll not rest until he's snapped his teeth on bone. The sheriff's coin is sweetened double for your head now, Robin. Some say triple if they drag you to Nottingham breathing." Robin's gaze flicked to the sleeping shapes of the children, their small hands tucked under thin cheeks, hair damp with the damp of the hollow. He let the hush fill the space around his answer. "He can pay in gold or gallows," Robin said at last. "We'll pay in patience." He rose then, brushing dirt from his knees. "Much," he called quietly. The miller's son emerged from the shadows by the far wall, wiping mushroom broth from his chin. "Aye, Robin." "Fetch the carts from the lower copse before first light," Robin said. "The old tracks near the widow's hollow run softer than any highway. We'll move the young and the sick while Sir Guy hunts ghosts at the river's bend." Much nodded, already turning to gather his cloak. He paused at the doorway, a flicker of doubt passing over his open face. "You reckon he'll find the hermitage after we've gone?" Robin's eyes softened. "By the time he smells old ash here, we'll be halfway to Clipstone. And if he does come sooner, well, the hollow will be empty, save for the prayers Tuck leaves in the clay." Friar Tuck chuckled, settling beside Will by the brazier. "If the good knight wants my prayers, he'll find them fierce enough to sour his wine." The rain outside thickened, tapping the low thatch in soft, steady rhythms. Within that gentle drum, the outlaws moved as they always did, checking boots, binding cloaks, testing bowstrings, whispering plans that tied every deer path and fox run into the next village or stand of trees. Alan's fingers spun a tune that no one asked for but all welcomed. A ballad too soft for dancing, too warm for grief, threading through the hollow with the same quiet resolve that bound these men together. The children shifted in sleep, some dreaming of bread ovens unburned, some of roofs that would not spit cinders into the night. Robin stepped to the low door and ducked out once more, drawing the hood over his head as drizzle gathered on his lashes. The night beyond the clearing smelled of wet bracken and leaf mold, of old secrets buried deep in Sherwood's ribs. He moved a few paces into the dark, boots finding the hush between roots and stones. Kneeling in the dripping gloom, he laid the widow's charm along the deer path's entrance, pressing it firm into a tangle of nettle and ivy. Beneath his breath, he spoke words no king would hear, a promise, a warning, a prayer for the forest to hold its own. When he rose, the charm seemed to vanish into the green, as if the hollow itself had swallowed it whole. Robin glanced back once at the small amber glow spilling from the hermitage doorway, the fragile flame that held hope tight while the forest held its breath. Behind him, the wind shifted through the canopy, carrying the smell of distant hearth smoke and the ghost of Sir Guy's hounds. Somewhere beyond the trees, the sheriff's coin jingled in 100 pockets, ready to betray him. But here in the hush, beneath the old branches and dripping leaves, the forest chose silence over silver, shadows over betrayal. Robin turned back to the hollow, passing under the bramble-laced lintel just as Alan's tune fell quiet. Within, his band stirred like foxes at dawn, restless but faithful, each one knowing that so long as the greenwood whispered secrets through the rain, they were more than hunted men. They were the roots that no sheriff's fire could dig out, and above the hush, the charm waited, nettle, ash, and quiet promise, holding Sir Guy's hounds at bay while the forest covered Robin Hood's tracks with every hidden path it had ever known. By dawn, the hermitage lay empty, but for a few smoldering coals and the echo of whispered prayers that clung to its clay walls. Where once the old and the young huddled together in fear and damp warmth, now only silence remained, wrapped in the hush of drifting mist. Robin and his band had slipped away under the cover of the widow's charm, leaving no prints save for the soft indent of cartwheels, masked by pine boughs dragged behind. When Sir Guy of Gisborne arrived at the hollow that morning, he found only shadows and the brittle crackle of cold ashes under his boot. His hounds circled the clearing, noses pressed to damp moss, but each time they caught a scent, they lost it in nettles and bramble, their whines rising thin and confused beneath the hush of the trees. Sir Guy dismounted near the old doorway, brushing a strand of dark hair from his brow. Eyes narrowed to hard points beneath the rim of his helm. The sheriff's soldiers fanned out behind him, spears brushing low branches, mail rustling like distant water. He ducked into the hollow, boots scraping the clay floor. The brazier lay cold, its ashes scattered as if by careless wind. He kicked it aside, sending a puff of soot drifting into the gloom. One of his men stepped forward, bowing his head. "No sign, sir. The villagers must have guided them out before the rains." Sir Guy's jaw worked tight beneath his stubbled cheek. He crouched near a scrap of burlap left behind, lifting it between thumb and forefinger. It smelled of smoke, nettle, and the ghost of warm bread. He let it drop. "Did you check the deer paths?" he asked, voice low and sharp as a drawn blade. "Aye," the man stammered. "Dogs won't hold the trail. It's as though the forest itself eats our tracks." Sir Guy finished the thought for him, voice quiet but fierce. He rose, brushing dust from his leather gloves. Robin Hood plays at spirits and shadows, but he is flesh, and flesh grows careless. He stepped back into the gray morning, scanning the underbrush where a drift of mist still lingered. The smell of damp bracken mingled with the faint sweetness of wood smoke, the last sign of the outlaws' hidden refuge. "Burn it," Sir Guy said. The soldiers hesitated. One cast a glance at the hounds, who sat with ears flat, heads low, unwilling to nose further into the hollow's roots. Sir Guy's dark eyes flashed. "I said burn it." They scattered dry bracken through the low door, snapped branches from nearby hazel, and fed the coals with what scraps they found. Soon smoke rose in thin columns, struggling to cling to the sodden beams. The damp wood resisted, spitting and hissing, but at last the flames caught hold. Sir Guy watched as the old hermitage breathed out its final warmth in a shudder of sparks and drifting cinders. The forest watched too, though no leaf whispered its secrets to him. When the timbers crackled loud enough to mask his words, Sir Guy turned to the captain at his shoulder. "We drive them west now, into the bogs. No path through reed and mire stays hidden for long." "And the villagers?" the captain asked, unease shadowing his voice. Sir Guy's lip curled. "Anyone who feeds him starves twice as fast. Burn the barley stores in Edwinstowe. Let their children cry for the bread Robin steals. When hunger barks louder than any sheriff's hounds, they'll hand him over for a crust." He swung into the saddle, spurring the roan with a snap of his reins. Around him, the men fell in line. Spears lowered, torches carried low to catch the dry edges of any thatch or hedge that dared stand between them and the greenwood secrets. Behind them, the hermitage burned to damp ruin, its prayers curling skyward as ash. But deep in the trees, well beyond the bog and bramble, Robin and his people moved in patient silence, winding through paths that no Norman map had ever claimed. By late afternoon, the carts rumbled along an old track that only the oldest charcoal burners remembered. The rain had eased to a mist that clung to every cloak and bristled the hair at the napes of necks. Robin walked beside the lead cart, one hand steady on the ox's yoke. Beside him, Much trudged ankle-deep in mud, boots patched with bits of sacking to keep out the worst of the bog water. Behind them, Little John urged the second cart forward with low murmurs and soft clucks to the plodding oxen. The children huddled in the straw bed, drifting between sleep and half-formed dreams of smoke and hidden roots. Alan rode point ahead, slipping between trees like a fox, eyes sharp for any sign of Sir Guy's scouts. Will trailed at the rear, blade loose at his hip, his grin muted by the weight of drizzle and the wariness settling into his bones. At a bend where the old track spilled into a clearing, choked with young ash saplings, Robin halted the lead cart and called his men close. Their breath misted in the soft gloom, the hush of the forest pressing close around their circle. "They've burned the hollow," Robin said, voice low but steady. "Next, they'll strip the villages bare. Sir Guy wants the hungry to turn against us." Little John's brow furrowed beneath the fringe of damp hair plastered to his forehead. "And if hunger's bark grows louder than our promise?" Robin's eyes swept the circle. Much his honest worry, Alan's tired grin, Will's restless shifting. He thought of the widow's charm buried under nettles, the children sleeping behind them in the cart, the faint warmth that flickered still in the heart of Sherwood no matter how many fires the sheriff lit. "Then we remind them," Robin said, his voice carrying just enough to steady the hush, "that the forest feeds more than fear. Sir Guy forgets. We are thorn and root both. He bleeds himself raw each time he reaches for us." Alan laughed, quiet but bright. A thorn in the sheriff's hand. Will's grin returned then, crooked but fierce. "And we prick deeper yet." Robin placed a hand on the ox's bristled neck. "Tonight we hide the wagons in the old bog path. Tomorrow we strike where they hoard the grain meant for the king's tax. Every sack we scatter is a promise that the forest does not forget its people." The drizzle turned to soft rain again, pattering through the young ash leaves like applause too distant to be heard by any sheriff's hound. In that clearing, half bog, half forest, Robin Hood's oath twined tight as root and thorn together. That so long as a single tree stood against the sky, no tyrant's grip would bleed the greenwood dry. Night returned to Sherwood on a hush of drifting rain and the soft murmur of leaves turning silver under the moon. In the hollow of a long-forgotten bog path, Robin's small caravan had come to rest beneath a ragged canopy of alder and willow. where the carts stood hidden beneath cut reeds and wet bracken. No torchlight touched this place. No hoofbeats echoed here. Only the forest's breath and the soft stirring of sleepers buried in straw and wool. Robin stood watch at the bog's edge where firmer ground rose just enough to keep the worst of the wet from soaking through boots and cloak. The faint glow of a half-moon peered through breaks in the low mist, enough to catch the line of his bow where it rested across his chest. Behind him, Alan Adale crouched over a small flame, hidden by a circle of stones and the drape of a patched cloak to keep its light from wandering eyes. He warmed a wedge of bread over the embers, humming a melody that barely rose above the sigh of night insects. Little John returned from the darkness then, boots sinking silent in the peat as he dropped to a crouch beside Robin. Rain still clung to his hair and shoulders, glittering like tiny beads of glass. "They're quartered at the King's Mill," John murmured, voice low enough to be mistaken for wind if any ear, but Robin's listened. 4 wagons loaded for the tax run at dawn. 5 men stand watch. 2 dogs. Robin's jaw tightened just enough to show his mind was already moving beyond the news. He glanced at the children asleep in the carts behind them, the sick bundled in straw and borrowed blankets, the small sacks of barley that would last but a week if no new grain found its way beneath Sherwood's branches. "Sir Guy's pride," Robin said. "He thinks if he guards his wagons with dogs and bribes, he'll starve us into open ground." Little John's grin cracked the hush. "Then let's loosen the leash. Dogs can't bark what they can't see." Alan drifted closer, flicking crumbs into the shadows where a pair of field mice scurried near the bog's rim. The mill's on flat ground. One approached by the road, one by the river bend. Robin crouched to trace the damp earth with the tip of an arrow. He shaped the mill's squat outline, the broad wheel that turned day and night on the sluggish stream. He tapped 2 spots with his thumb, one at the road's edge, one where the river's hush grew deep enough to swallow the noise of boots. "John and I take the river," Robin said. "Alan and Will strike from the road. Much will wait by the woods with a cart. Tuck stays here to guard the wagons and remind hungry bellies why we fight." Alan flicked the last crumb into the dark and dusted his hands. "We'll need the dogs quiet." "I'll see to them," John said, voice steady as the rain's hush. Robin rose then, rolling his shoulders as though to shake off the mist that clung to every thought. He glanced at the sleeping children one more time. Thin arms curled beneath cheeks, breath drifting white in the chill. It would take only one missed raid, one failed theft, for Sir Guy's plan to choke the life from these woods. He turned to Alan, voice calm but threaded with iron. "No flames. No blood if we can help it. We take the wagons and vanish like ghosts. Let Sir Guy wake to the ruin of his pride, not his men's corpses." Alan dipped his head in agreement. Ballads sound sweeter without a trail of graves. Dawn was still far when they moved out, shapes woven into the mist that drifted along the stream's bend. Robin felt the damp seep into his boots, the chill bite through his cloak. But these were old companions now. Reminders that the forest did not coddle its children, but tested them until root and thorn grew from the same branch. They found the mill crouched beside the sluggish water, its broad wheel turning in slow groans that blended with the sigh of the reeds. 4 wagons stood in the yard, huddled in the lee of the stone wall. A single torch guttered by the door, watched over by 2 men hunched beneath their cloaks, eyes half shut against the drizzle. Somewhere near the wheel, the dogs stirred, dark shapes that whined low and restless as the scent of strangers drifted across the water. Little John slid ahead through the reeds, moving so softly he might have been a shadow untethered from the earth. Robin followed a heartbeat behind, boots finding stone and root with practiced care. The first dog lifted its head, ears pricking. John knelt low, palm outstretched. From his belt, he drew a scrap of smoked venison, flicking it soft into the grass. The dog's nose twitched, one sniff, another. Then the hound padded forward, tail low, hunger stronger than its training. A second scrap, another step. The other hound followed, pulled by the promise of meat that did not come from Sir Guy's rough hands. Within moments, both lay muzzled and bound gentle cloth, their eyes half closed in the hush of sleep brought on by Tuck's tincture. A drop slipped into the meat before dusk. Robin watched the dogs drift under, their breath steady. His own breath left him in a quiet plume. He tapped John's shoulder once, then moved on. Alan and Will waited at the road's edge, shapes half swallowed by bramble. When Robin signaled, they drifted forward like dusk undone, blades ready, eyes sharp for any fool who might rouse at the wrong moment. One guard shifted, lifting the torch to peer into the drifting mist, and found Will's grin waiting. The guard barely had time to gasp before a soft blow with the staff's end sent him folding into the mud. The other turned, mouth wide. Alan's lute string, drawn taut and silent, settled him to sleep beside the sacks of barley he'd sworn to protect. By the mill door, Robin pressed his palm to the rough timber, felt the hum of the wheel turning inside, the slow grind of stones that fed no peasant's bowl, only the king's coffers. He unlatched the iron bar, nudged the door just wide enough for the hush to slip through. No alarm, no roused shout, just the patient wheel and the quiet song of the stream. Outside, Much wheeled the first cart from the woods, his grin wide in the moonlight. Alan and Will loaded sacks in silence, backs bent beneath the weight of another promise kept, another meal for empty bellies beneath Sherwood's sheltering arms. When the last wheel turned into the forest's waiting hush, Robin looked back at the mill. Stone, wood, and iron that served a crown that never saw the men who starved beside it. He felt no need to set flame to it tonight. Hunger would do more than fire ever could. They vanished then, carts rolling slow through the reeds. No mark left, but the shallow furrow of fresh hope carved into England's dreaming earth. And when dawn rose above the mill, Sir Guy's wagons were gone. The dogs still slept, and the forest fed its own once more. By the time the sun's first pale breath slipped through the canopy, Robin and his band were far from the king's mill, hidden deep among Sherwood's oldest oaks. The stolen grain rumbled behind them in 2 wagons drawn by oxen too tired to protest. The wheels creaked softly over roots and damp soil, muffled by moss and the hush of dawn. They had left no torchlight, no broken bodies, only the bewildered hush of the sheriff's men waking to find the wagons vanished, the hounds still snoring beside the mill wheel. Sir Guy's pride once again had been cut not with steel but with silence. Robin walked at the side of the second wagon, his hand brushing the rough sacking draped over barley and oats. Much, the miller's son, perched on the driver's plank, boots swinging, eyes bright despite the long night's work. "You should sleep, lad," Robin said, voice low so as not to wake the children huddled among sacks and straw. Much shook his head, grinning. "Sleep? When I can drive the king's grain through the king's own woods, I'd sooner dream with my eyes open." Beside them, Will Scarlet dozed as he walked, dagger sheathed at his hip, hands tucked into his cloak to steal a scrap of warmth. Alan Adale hummed behind the first wagon, his lute slung over his shoulder, the quiet chords drifting like mist between trees, waking to the pale gold of dawn. The path they followed twisted through a low hollow where Hazel and Rowan tangled together, weaving a living tunnel that only those born of Sherwood's hush could find. It spilled them into a clearing where 3 stone cottages like secrets kept too long. Their roofs were patched with bracken and straw, walls leaning beneath years of weather and the weight of the sheriff's tax. As the wagons rolled in, smoke drifted from a single chimney, thin, gray, no more than a poor man's whisper of warmth. A dog barked once from behind a wattle fence, but it fell silent when Little John appeared beside the lead ox, his shadow enough to hush any noise that might betray them. Robin motioned to Much, who eased the cart to a stop near the largest cottage. An old woman emerged from the low doorway, her back bent, hair bound in a kerchief the color of earth. Beside her stood a boy of perhaps 12, barefoot despite the frost clinging to the grass. His eyes widened when he saw the wagons, the sacks, and the men who stepped down into the clearing with blades and bows at their sides. "Mother Nan," Robin greeted, stepping forward. He bowed his head, though he wore no crown but the green hood that marked him outlaw. "The forest sends you back what the sheriff would keep for his table." The old woman's mouth trembled as she lifted a thin hand to her lips. For a moment, she looked beyond Robin's shoulder, as if fearing the sheriff's men would burst from the trees, blades raised to take this promise away again. But only Will stepped forward, lifting a sack with ease and laying it at her feet. "Barley and oats," he said. "Enough for bread that lasts longer than sorrow." The boy darted forward, knelt beside the sack, and pressed his ear to it, as if to hear the grain whisper secrets only a hungry child could understand. Mother Nan's voice cracked through the hush. They burned Martin's barn. They took the miller's wheel. They said the king's tithe came first, that we'd feast on mercy if we kept quiet. Robin crouched before her, his hands closing around hers, hands thin and cold, skin mapped with years of hard ground and harsh taxes. "Mercy," he said softly, "doesn't fill an oven or mend a roof." Little John stepped from the shadows then, his great arms full of another sack. Alan leaned his lute against the fence and carried a third, humming a lullaby for the boy who watched with eyes so wide they reflected dawn itself. They stacked the grain beneath the cottage eaves, covered in oilcloth to guard against the damp. Much found a clay jar of salt pork hidden deep in the wagon's corner and pressed it into Mother Nan's hands. "For the soup," he said shyly, cheeks flushed with the weight of so small a gift. She caught his wrist before he could pull away and pressed her forehead to his rough knuckles. "God keep you in his pocket, lad." Robin rose, stepping back to watch the little yard fill with quiet life once more. The boy dragging a sack toward the door, Nan brushing tears from her cheek with the back of her hand, Alan's soft tune curling around them all like smoke from a warm hearth. "Where will you go next?" Nan asked, her voice steadier now. "Sir Guy will hunt you like a boar once he finds your tracks." Robin's smile was a hush in the drifting dawn. "Tracks don't linger where the forest swallows them. We leave enough bread behind to mend the fear he sows. If he burns a roof, we patch 10. If he steals a sack, we return 3. Will joined him, tucking his hands under his cloak again. "Word will carry," he said. "They'll know the greenwood keeps its promise." Nan straightened, her back bending a little less beneath the morning chill. "And when the sheriff's men come to my door?" Robin's eyes met hers, a soft fire in his tired face. "Tell them the bread came from a neighbor's kindness. No more, no less. Let them swing their swords at the wind if they must." When all was done, the wagons rolled on, lighter than when they came, leaving behind full bins where ashes once lay. The boy watched them vanish into the hush, his small hand pressed to the fence rail like a promise to remember. And so the forest breathed easier for one more day. The grain hidden beneath old thatch, the embers of defiance warm in the cottage ovens. Far behind, Sir Guy's dogs would nose cold trails through bog and hollow, never knowing that the greenwood's greatest arrow was not iron nor oak, but bread shared beneath broken roofs, where hope rose like smoke from a fire that no king's tithe could quench. By dusk the wagons were hidden again, this time beneath a tangle of thorn and alder, not far from a stream that wound through Sherwood, like a secret whispered from tree to tree. The grain now lay safe in quiet crofts and clay bins tucked beneath cottage floors, watched over by mothers and old men who knew when to guard their tongues and when to let their hope slip through shuttered windows as rumor and song. With the cargo gone, Robin's band gathered in a shallow hollow where bracken rose waist-high and mist clung to every bent frond. There they crouched in a loose circle, the hush between them broken only by the restless sigh of the wind stirring the bramble above. Will Scarlet drew his blade across a block of whetstone in slow, patient strokes. Each pass rasped softly, the sound as much a warning as a comfort. Alan Adale perched on a mossed stump nearby, lute silent tonight, his sharp eyes turned to the darkening path that led toward the sheriff's western road. Little John sat cross-legged on the damp earth, his massive staff across his knees like a squire's spear laid in quiet readiness. Much, who never could sit still, shifted from foot to foot, glancing at Robin as though each heartbeat might yet bring orders that would carry them deeper into danger. Robin himself knelt near the edge of the hollow, cloak drawn tight about his shoulders, bow laid across his thighs. He studied the track beyond the bracken, a faint thread of beaten soil where the sheriff's patrols now wandered with more bluster than sense. Tonight, rumor said Sir Guy's men would ride that very path, weighed down with coins collected from farmers too worn to argue and too hungry to keep silent. A tax meant for Nottingham's coffers, but bound to be lined first into Sir Guy's purse, a private reward for weeks of futile hunts and wasted hounds. Robin traced a line in the earth with his forefinger, carving the path into the wet soil. 3 riders, he murmured to himself. 2 wagons, 2 hounds, if they've learned nothing from the widow's charm. Will lifted his blade from the whetstone, the steel keen enough to catch the last thin scraps of light. Not much steel for so much coin. Alan's smile was a shadow in the bracken. He thinks hunger and cold will guard his gold for him. Little John's voice rumbled low. Better hope he does. I'd sooner face 3 fat men than 30 hungry fathers forced into his service. Robin brushed his thumb over his bowstring, testing its tension. A clean strike, he said, fast as breath. We take the coin, scatter the horses, and vanish before they know they're ghosts in our woods. Much spoke up then, voice uncertain. And if the coins don't reach the king's man by the new moon, what then? Robin turned to him, his gaze steady but kind. Then the king's man rides to Nottingham and tells the sheriff he's lost his tax twice over. Sir Guy will tighten his grip, yes. But every coin we scatter buys the villages another week with bread in their mouths. Much nodded, his jaw set firm despite the unease in his eyes. He drew a small dagger from his belt and turned it over in his palm. Old, its handle worn smooth by hands that never learned to carry it with pride, but carried it still. Robin rose, brushing dirt from his knees. Alan, watch the far bend. Will, you and Much take the left flank under the bramble. John and I hold the path. Will's grin flickered sharp beneath the last smear of dusk. And when Sir Guy's men see they're not hunting hares tonight. Robin's mouth curved, not a smile, but something harder and older than any grin. Then they'll learn the bracken holds more than rabbits. The band melted into the hollow's shadows, each man folding into the hush as easily as mist folds into root and stone. Alan slipped first, a fox among the twisting birch trunks, ears tuned for the telltale clink of iron bits and tired hooves. Will nudged. Much forward, the pair sliding on their bellies beneath a tangle of thorn where the bracken rose tall enough to hide 2 beating hearts. Robin and Little John took the track itself, crouched among last year's fallen leaves. Robin's breath slowed to match the hush around him. In, out, each heartbeat a quiet promise that no crown's coin would pass through Sherwood tonight without first feeding its keepers. A branch snapped in the hush. Alan's soft bird call drifted through the bracken. 3 short notes, then 2. Robin's hand tightened on his bow. The patrol emerged slow and careless, just as rumor promised. 3 men on lean horses, chainmail glinting in dull strips between worn cloaks. Behind them trundled a single small cart piled high with hemp sacks. A single hound nosed the wheel, ears flicking at every whisper in the brush. One of the riders, broad-shouldered, helmet askew, leaned forward to smack the driver with his reins. Keep it rolling, fool. Nottingham won't wait for your cart's old bones. Robin rose as silent as the mist. He loosed his first arrow into the earth before the horse's hooves, a warning sharp enough to make the lead horse rear, iron shoes slashing the air. The riders froze, eyes darting between the shadows that closed around them with no battle cry, only the hush of bracken parting for drawn blades. Will stepped from the thorn like a wolf, stepping from snow. Much flanked him, wide-eyed but steady, dagger catching the torchlight from the cart's lantern. Alan's figure hovered near the rear wheel, his lute slung forgotten in favor of the small blade he now pressed to the driver's hip. Little John rose beside Robin, staff resting heavy in his palm. He spoke before the riders found their voices. No harm if you step down quiet and walk back the way you came. The broad-shouldered rider spat. Outlaws, rats in the brush. Robin's second arrow flicked past the man's ear and buried itself in the cart's plank. The hound at the wheel gave a single startled bark, then slunk beneath the cart as if it knew better than to test the hush that ruled this stretch of road. Robin's voice came soft but ironclad. Walk, or stay for the bracken to finish what the crown forgot. The riders dropped from their saddles one by one, boots sinking into the damp path. One left his sword on the cart's plank, another kicked it aside himself, eyes fixed on the hush where Alan's blade glinted near his ribs. Within moments, the horses vanished into the underbrush, startled away by Will's quick slap to their flanks. The men stumbled into the dark, their curses swallowed by the hush of the woods that had claimed them. Robin turned to the cart. Sacks of coin and wheat, taxes squeezed from empty hearths and cold fields. He rested a hand on the rough wood, feeling its promise beneath his palm. Feed the roots, he said softly. Will and Much set to work without another word. In the bracken's hush, no horns sounded, no boots thundered. Only quiet laughter and the soft clink of gold meeting hungry hands. Another wound for the sheriff's purse, another breath for Sherwood's hidden heart. And when they melted back into the mist, they left only footprints in the soft earth. A blade in the bracken where no crown's law could find it. Long after the riders fled and the stolen coins were hidden beneath Sherwood's roots, the hush returned to the forest, wrapping Robin Hood and his band in the first true chill of the turning season. Dawn found them deeper among ancient oaks, where the trees grew so close their branches knitted together like old hands clasped against the cold. They had chosen this hollow for its secrecy, a natural bowl in the earth, ringed by bracken and old beech, whose roots clawed through soft loam like patient sentries. Here, with no wagons left to guard, they made a rough camp. A single careful fire flickered under a canopy of woven hazel, its glow hidden beneath a cover of damp ferns to keep its smoke low and secret. Robin sat near the flames, sleeves pushed to his elbows as he held his hands out to the meager warmth. Much dozed beside him, a blanket of bracken draped over his shoulders, his breath rising in soft white plumes. Alan's lute lay across his lap, but no tune stirred its strings tonight. His fingers too numb, his voice too weary to weave song from the cold. Will Scarlet crouched by the fire's edge, blade in hand, the point pressed idly into the soft earth as he carved slow circles around his boots. Little John leaned back against an oak trunk behind them, staff across his knees like a promise no chill could break. The coins lay hidden a mile away, buried beneath an old stump, marked with a sign only they would know, a split branch bound with nettle twine. By morning, the silver would find its way to hungry hands, slipped through cottage shutters by careful feet, tucked into baskets of stale bread, as though by some spirit of the greenwood itself. But tonight, wariness pressed down like frost. Even the forest seemed to listen for the crack of Sir Guy's hounds, or the sudden thunder of hooves through the hush. Will's voice broke the quiet at last. "It'll be colder by the new moon," he said, turning the point of his knife in the soil. "They say snows come early in York already." Much stirred at that, blinking sleep from his eyes. "We've enough barley to stretch the villages through Michaelmas. After that—" He didn't finish. The hush finished it for him. Robin stared into the flames, eyes reflecting each flicker, as though weighing every ember like a coin spent too soon. "Sherwood's roots hold deep," he said at last. "But they've never carried us through a hard winter without help." Little John's low voice rumbled from the shadows. "Then we'll raid the king's tithe again. There's grain enough piled high in Nottingham's stores to feed every hearth from here to the river." Alan glanced at him over the top of his lute. "Aye, and 30 fresh men with pikes stand guard on that store now. Sir Guy won't sleep again until he's pinned our skins to the gates." Robin lifted his eyes from the flames to the canopy above. There the stars burned between bare branches, cold and far and old as England's bones. He felt the forest's hush press close, listening, waiting for him to bind word to promise. "Then we don't wait for Sir Guy's wagons," Robin said. "We take the store before the frost binds the roads. We break his iron gate while his men sleep drunk on the king's wine. We scatter the barley, the rye, the salt pork, every crumb he hoards to buy loyalty from men too hungry to stand on their own feet." Much shifted, hope flickering behind the worry in his eyes. "A raid on Nottingham itself?" Robin nodded. "A pledge, one the sheriff can't burn from the rooftops or drown in blood. Winter will come, aye, but so will our promise, hidden in every hearth, every oven that finds its warmth, because we chose the hard road." Will's grin returned then, sharp and sly. He flicked a pinch of dirt into the fire. "Robin Hood against the sheriff's gates. Now that's a ballad even Alan might manage." Alan's laugh cracked the hush, soft but real. He tapped his fingers on the lute's hollow belly. "If we're to raid Nottingham, I'll need a tune fit for kings, or fools who think they're kings." Little John pushed himself upright, the full shape of him like a great oak rising from the shadows. "When do we move?" "Soon," Robin said. He looked to each man in turn, letting his eyes rest on Much's young face, on Alan's quick grin, on Will's steady blade, and John's patient strength. "Soon. But not blind. We need word from inside the walls. Alan, find a voice in the taverns. Someone who sees the guard change at dawn, who knows when the gate stands half-barred for a brewer's cart or a priest's donkey. Alan gave a mock bow, half hidden by the dark. A minstrel can hear much when the ale flows. Robin reached for the small pouch at his belt and tossed it into Alan's waiting hands. A handful of the sheriff's own coin, stolen back for the price of secrets. Much settled back down, drawing the bracken closer about his shoulders. His voice came soft as sleep. "We'll feed them all, won't we, Rob? Even when the snow comes." Robin's answer was not boast, nor vow, but something older than both. So long as Sherwood breathes, so do its people. Will stirred the fire one last time, sending sparks drifting up into the cold night. Above, the canopy swallowed them into the hush, small lights that flared and vanished, like hope itself, fragile yet stubborn, carried by every hidden root and secret branch that bound Robin Hood's world together. And somewhere beyond that hush, behind stone walls and iron gates, the sheriff's men drank their fill of wine and warmth, blind to the winter pledge being whispered among the bracken. A pledge older than crowns, stronger than chains. That hunger would find no easy victory while Robin Hood still walked beneath Sherwood's watchful boughs. By the next dusk, Alan Adale found himself far from Sherwood's hush and root-bound shelter. His boots scraped the frozen ruts of the Nottingham road. His cloak tugged tight about his shoulders to hide the battered loot slung over his back. Lanterns swung from crooked posts ahead, spilling puddles of gold onto muddy stones slick with frost. The smell of wood smoke and cheap ale drifted on the cold air like a promise that warmth could still be bought if a man had coin or song enough to earn it. He pushed through the low door of the Red Stag Inn just as a gust of wind rattled the latch behind him. The air inside hit him like a slap, thick with sweat, spilled cider, and the stale tang of too many unwashed coats pressed shoulder to shoulder. A rough hearth glowed at the far wall, its embers, fighting to warm men, hunched over their mugs. By the door, a pair of the sheriff's men sat nursing weak ale, helmets perched on the table between them like iron skulls, daring anyone to forget who owned this patch of England tonight. Alan lowered his head, shaking the drizzle from his cloak. He caught the barkeep's eye, a stout man with a nose red as the stag painted on the warped sign outside. With a nod, the barkeep gestured to the corner near the hearth, where the bench waited for any soul desperate enough to sing for warmth. Alan slipped through the crush of elbows and tankards. He settled on the rough bench, pulled his lute into his lap, and began tuning the strings with slow, deliberate care. He felt the gaze of the soldiers flick toward him, then drift away again when they recognized neither threat nor coin in a half-soaked bard. A man beside the hearth spat into the flames and grunted, "You best not sing of kings tonight, minstrel. Sheriff'll hang your tune on the gates if it don't praise his purse." Alan's fingers plucked a soft chord. "No kings tonight," he said, voice easy as warm wine. "Just a tale of dogs who chase foxes too clever by half." A ripple of laughter rolled through the shadows closest to the hearth. The soldiers stiffened, but Alan was already singing, low and sweet, words curling through the smoke like a hush that begged men to lean closer. He sang of a black wolf who hunted in vain, of wagons that vanished down deer paths older than Norman gold. He sang of bread hidden beneath clay floors, of children who slept warm while the taxman's purse grew lighter than frost on a morning field. And as he sang, he listened. He listened to the shifting feet of the sheriff's men by the door. He caught their muttered curses about wasted hounds, and coins slipped through careless fingers. He saw the flicker of fear in a stable boy's eyes when the soldiers spat threats of another sweep through Edwinstowe. And then, as the final chord faded into the heart's hiss, he caught the whisper he'd come for. Two men leaned against the bar, one with a patchy beard, the other with a crooked back bent low from years of hauling barrels and bones. Their words were meant for each other, but the fire's crackle gave them no cover. "Carts from the king's store roll out at dawn," the bent one rasped, his voice rough as old rope. "3 wagons, stacked with rye and barley for the bishop's table. Sheriff's own guard leads them clear through the southern gate." The bearded man grunted. "Aye, but the watch changes just before the bells. Sleepy lot, those lads. Half of 'em drunk on Sir Guy's scraps." Alan kept his eyes down, letting the notes of his last chord fade beneath the rumble of mugs striking wood. He filed the words away behind his easy smile. The southern gate, the dawn, the sleepy watch. A gap wide enough for Sherwood's promise to slip through like moonlight on snow. When he rose, the inn gave him no cheer nor coin, only a few nods from men too tired to risk a song that cut too close to truth. But the barkeep slid him a heel of coarse bread wrapped in a strip of old linen. "For the song," the barkeep muttered, eyes flicking toward the sheriff's men, "and for the fox that outwits the hounds." Alan touched 2 fingers to his brow in thanks and slipped into the cold once more. Behind him, the Red Stag's door thumped shut, the warm stink of sweat and cider sealed inside. Outside, the frost had crept thicker across the ruts, turning mud to brittle crust. Alan's boots found the quiet path away from the main road, ducking behind a row of tumbled hedges where moonlight spilled silver on the frozen bramble. There, half hidden by a leaning oak, a shape uncurled from the shadows, Will Scarlet, dagger glinting faintly at his hip, his grin sharp as the wind. "Well?" Will asked, voice low enough to vanish into the hush of sleeping fields. Alan held up the crust of bread like a prize. Enough to feed a plan. He told Will everything in a few careful whispers. The wagons, the southern gate, the careless watch trading wine for vigilance. By the time he finished, Will's grin had turned feral. "Then the bishop's table will be lighter this winter," Will said, "and our folk heavier by the loaf." Alan tucked the bread into his cloak. "If we move before the bells, they'll never guess we've slipped behind their iron gate." Will clapped his shoulder once, guiding him into the deeper hush beneath the tangled hedge. "Come on, Fox. Sherwood's waiting for your tale." Together they vanished into the frost-bound lane, boots brushing nettle and thorn, the cold no match for the warmth carried in the small promise they bore back toward the sleeping forest. A whisper that by dawn, bread meant for fat lords and cold chapels would feed the hidden hearths that no crown's decree could claim. And in every cottage where that bread found a home, another hush would bloom. The secret hush that Robin Hood still walked free beneath the dreaming boughs of England's oldest woods. When the first pale ribbon of dawn slipped between the black teeth of Nottingham's high walls, Robin Hood and his band were already waiting beneath the hush of the southern gate. They had come through the frost before the world stirred, moving through frozen ditches and tangled hedgerows until stone and iron rose above them like a crouching beast, blind to the fox slipping under its belly. Beyond the gate, 3 wagons stood beneath flickering torches, their oxen stamping cold-hoofed on the packed earth. The wagons brimmed with rye and barley, salted pork wrapped in linen sacks, small barrels of dried fish, tribute bound for the bishop's table and the sheriff's purse both. The guards posted at the gate huddled close to the brazier, their breath rising in white plumes that drifted away faster than their watchful eyes. Alan Adale pressed himself to the crumbling base of the outer wall, listening for the soft jingle of harness, the muted curses of men too weary to care for the cargo they guarded. Beside him crouched Will Scarlet, blade bare, breath steady, grin hidden in the folds of his hood. Further back, Little John lay flat in the ditch's hollow, his staff resting like a felled sapling across his massive shoulder. Robin watched them all from the shadows of an old yew that leaned so close to the wall its branches seemed stitched to the stones. He held his bow unstrung for now. No need for arrows yet, not when the hush was weapon enough. The watch changed just before the bells, just as rumor promised. One group of guards stamped off toward the keep, half drunk from the night's cheap wine. The new watch, 2 men with pikes and dull eyes, stepped into place by the gate's inner arch. One leaned his weight against the iron hinge, the other fussed with a piece of stale bread stuffed in his cheek. Neither looked twice at the wagons waiting to roll. Alan's low whistle drifted to Robin's ear. 3 short notes, the fox's sign. Robin lifted his hand, fingers brushing the yew's rough bark, then dropped it quick as an arrow's flight. Much the miller's son rose from where he'd crawled under a broken fence. He wore the hood of a stable boy, his boots wrapped in rags to muffle his steps. In one hand he held a crooked staff like any honest drover might carry. He ambled toward the lead ox, murmuring nonsense to the beast as he touched the traces, slipping the latch on the yoke with fingers swift and certain. When the guard by the hinge turned, frowning at the shifting ox, Alan stepped out from the wall's shadow, lute in hand. He strummed a single note, off-key enough to draw a laugh but not alarm. "Morning, good sirs," Alan called, voice sweet as cider. "I bring the bishop's blessing for a cold dawn and a warm song for honest men." The pike-bearer squinted at him, baffled. "No songs here, bard. We guard coin and barley, not ears for your strumming." Alan took a step closer, plucking a second, brighter chord. "Then let my song guard your boredom, friend. A tune keeps cold toes warmer than stale bread." The guard with the bread scowled at the mention of his secret meal, shifting to hide the crust in his cloak. As they turned half away, Alan winked at Much, who gave the ox a gentle slap. The beast jerked forward, startled, hooves scraping the stones. The second wagon lurched after it, its wheel catching the rut that Robin himself had carved into the frozen track hours before. A loud crack split the hush. The wheel snapped half from its rim, spilling sacks of barley into the path. Dust and husk billowed into the torchlight, blinding the guards who stumbled back with muffled curses. From the ew's shadow, Robin moved. One heartbeat, he was root and branch. The next, he was breath and leather boots, stepping into the broken circle of startled men. His voice cut through the barley's hiss like a drawn blade. "Gentlemen," he said, calm as still water, "your watch is ended." The pike-bearer spun toward him, but Little John rose behind the man like a tree lifting from winter sleep. His staff swung once, clean as a monk's blessing. The pike clattered from numb fingers, landing in the spilled grain. Alan's lute rang out. Not a tune this time, but a sharp crack as he used its battered back to clip the second guard's knee. Much caught the ox's halter, leading the beast around the broken wheel. Will appeared from the ditch, dagger flashing just enough to steer the men's panic away from the cargo and into the open road. Robin stepped to the lead wagon's bench. "Drive, Much," he murmured, quiet as the dawn. Much clambered up, tugged the reins. The startled ox plodded forward through the broken gates, trailing the second and third wagons like shadows slipping from stone to bracken. One guard moaned on his knees, clutching a bruised thigh, but neither found the breath to shout. Alan knelt before him, pressing a single coin, the sheriff's own silver, into the man's trembling hand. "Keep your mouth shut," Alan said, voice gentle as a lullaby, "and dream tonight of songs sweeter than tacksmen's threats." Then they were gone, 3 wagons rolling beneath the gate's old arch, through the first spill of dawn that could not touch them. Their wheels carried a bishop's table into Sherwood's waiting arms, barley and rye enough to scatter hope like seed across the frosted ground. Behind them, Nottingham's walls rose silent and blind, never guessing that the hush they feared most had slipped beneath their iron hinges like breath beneath a door. Robin's boots found the path first. Little John's staff thumped the frozen ruts clear of snow. Will's laughter drifted through the waking hush, sharper than frost, warm enough to remind the trees that winter could not choke a promise once sown in roots older than any sheriff's crown. And so the wagons rolled on, dawn spilling behind them, not ahead, leaving in their wake a hush full of bread and stolen warmth that no stone wall could hold back. Beneath Sherwood's ancient boughs, the legend of Robin Hood turned its face to winter's teeth and grinned, unbowed, unbroken, and very much alive.